Chapter 1932. Another bee, of course, the attendant explained with a smile. There can be significant differences in the fighting prowess of cultivators despite the cap of cultivation here, and there would be no one who would be willing to challenge a person whom they know they can't win in the dueling ring. The main purpose of the dueling ring is to temper one's combat techniques, and this can only be done with a suitable opponent. Thus, in order to allow for better pairing of opponents, the dueling ring is divided into various tiers too. Zhongxian nodded in realization. Take him for example, competition at such a level couldn't even trigger his motivation at all, let alone sharpen his skills. The dueling rings are divided into primary, intermediate, and advanced. If you are able to win 10 rounds consecutively in a certain tier, you will be allowed to proceed to the next tier, the attendant explained. You currently have 8 rounds under you, which put you very close to intermediate tier. However, given the prowess you have displayed, it's unlikely that ordinary cultivators would dare to challenge you. If you really wish to push ahead, you might have to put down a reward, and as long as someone accepts the challenge and you are able to win 2 rounds consecutively, you will be qualified to enter the intermediate tier and fight with even stronger expert. Zhongxian nodded in response. Such a design was indeed logical. He would have done the same if he had been in Kongsha's place too. I'll propose a challenge then. Sure. How much money do you plan to put at stake? The attendant asked. 5,500 ethereal coins, Zhongxian replied as he passed his ethereal card over. As he had spent most of his earlier fortune on buying pills for the Dongshu gourd, he only had this much money left. 5,500 ethereal coins, the attendant shook his head with a bitter smile. That's too low. It'll be hard to get anyone to take on your bet. If there wasn't much to be earned from a duel, who would be willing to take it on? Under normal circumstances, the reward would have to be at least 50,000 ethereal coins for it to attract anyone at all. Only then would cultivators be willing to try their luck even if the odds were way against them. 5,500 ethereal coins. That was way too little. Just as the attendant thought that Zhongxian was being a little too stingy over here, a young man suddenly walked over with large strides and said, "I'll accept his challenge." The young man appeared to be in his mid-20s. There was a sword in his hand, which indicated that he was a sword practitioner. Beside him was a beautiful lady in her late teens by his side. They were none other than Hu Jianghe and Xue Qin. However, as those two had altered their appearances too, Zhongxian was unable to identify them either. You are willing to take up my challenge? Not expecting an opponent to come for him so quickly, Zhongxian heaved a sigh of relief. Putting on a harmless smile, he asked, since that's the case, are you willing to take up my bet too? Hearing that it was another bet, Hu Jianghe's face immediately turned livid as he remembered the unpleasant situation he was in earlier in the day. What kind of bet do you want to make? Simple. If I were to lose, I'll give you 100,000 ethereal coins. On the other hand, if you were to lose, you'll have to give me 100,000 ethereal coins. Zhongxian's initial thought was to raise the stakes to 500,000 ethereal coins, but he was afraid that it would scare his prey away, so he eventually chose a lower amount. He could tell that the other party had come here specially to challenge him, especially given the fact that the other party had accepted his challenge so quickly despite the low returns. While he did need an opponent at the moment, his primary goal was still to earn ethereal coins, and the easiest way to do so was through a bet. 100,000 ethereal coins? Can you even fork out such a sum? Hu Jianghe sneered coldly. As an expert of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, 100,000 ethereal coins was really nothing much to him. Nevertheless, he still had no intention of allowing others to take advantage of him. I think the problem over here is whether you are willing to accept my bet or not. I don't mind having a duel with you if you are willing to accept my bet, but otherwise, I don't really want to waste my time fighting with you. Zhongxian waved his hand dismissively. From the sword intent the person before him was emanating, Zhongxian could tell that the other party, just like Soaring Clouds and the others whom he had killed earlier, was a disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. According to Dan Xiaotian, disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion were highly esteemed in the Azure. The fact that the other party had come all the way here to challenge him likely meant that he was here to seek vengeance for those who were slain by his sword. Since that was the case, This meant that he could try pushing the other party a bit. Besides, it was hard work to suppress his cultivation down to a 20th of what it was. He couldn't execute most of his techniques, and it was extremely stifling for him. It was only natural that he should be rewarded handsomely for his effort. If he hadn't suppressed his strength, his opponent could very well be scarred for life. Audacious. It's your honor that Senior Hua wishes to challenge you to a battle. How dare you put on such an attitude before him? Xueqin bellowed coldly, displeased at World's Edge's dismissive attitude. It was very likely that Hua Jianghe would become an inner disciple by next year, and it should be the other party's honor to have such a powerful expert challenging him. Yet, the other party still seemed so reluctant, even demanding to hold a bet for it. Know your place. All right, that's enough. Hua Jianghe raised his hand to stop Xueqin. He looked at World's Edge once more and said, I don't mind having a bet with you. However, if you were to lose, I don't need your 100,000 ethereal coins. What I want you to do is admit your swordsmanship is beneath that of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion and follow me back to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion to become an outer disciple. 100,000 ethereal coins was a sum that he could afford to squander, but the reputation of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion had to be protected at any cost. News saying that Yun Feiyang and the others had lost were already going around town, and if he were to continue remaining idle as their first senior, it wouldn't be long before others begin saying that the disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion were weaker than mere unaffiliated cultivators. He couldn't let a minor incident like this mar the reputation of the sect. Besides, he had much to earn by recommending budding talents to the sect too. It would be considered a huge contribution from his part. Very well. Zhong Xian nodded. Those terms and conditions were nothing to him. Besides, lose. How is that even possible? That's a word which I have never written once in my life. Let's head to the dueling ring then. Having come to an agreement, the two of them quickly made their way over to the dueling ring. Look, World's Edge is here again. Is he going to fight with someone? That's great. I'm finally able to witness his transcendental skills once more. I can't even tell you how impressed I am with his techniques. Hurry up and call up those bunch of useless fools. If they were to miss World's Edge's match, they would probably hate us to death. Who is the one he's fighting with? A river's glance. I don't have any impression of this person at all. But the young lady that's beside him, Winter Zither, I think I have heard of her before. Who is she? Wait, let me think. Yes, that's right. She's the second young mistress of Shenjiang City. Her name seems to be Xueqin or something. She's quite a beaut, and her swordsmanship is amazing too. Discussions could be heard here and there. Hua Jianghe's nickname, A River's Glance, was the same one that he used elsewhere too. It was just that he had never been to Starlight City's ethereal hall, so no one here had heard of it before. However, it was different for Xueqin. As the daughter of the city lord, she was a frequent guest at the ethereal hall, and she had made quite a reputation for herself here too. Thus, many people were able to recognize her swiftly. This was similar to how top esports players were well known both on the net and in person, such as One Autumn Leaf Yi Qiu and Heng Soro Tian Ya, Xueqin. Those words weren't spoken discreetly, so Zhong Xian heard all of them loud and clear. He couldn't help but stop in his footsteps. Surely it couldn't be so coincidental. He was here just to buy a storage ring, but he still managed to encounter this rejected fiancé. Speaking of which, if Winter Zither was her, wouldn't that mean that A River's Glance was the fellow from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion who was here to recruit disciples? Earlier, the other party mentioned something like wanting to bring him to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion as an outer disciple too. Just as they were about to reach the dueling ring, Zhong Xian abruptly turned around to grab Xueqin. His movements were so quick that it caught the young lady off guard. She instinctively raised her sword to protect herself, but by the time her sword was up, the other party had already retracted his palm. There was a gentle smile on the other party's face. What are you doing? Xueqin questioned impatiently. She thought that an expert who had caught Senior Hua's eyes would at least conduct himself properly, but who could have thought that the latter would attempt to make a move on her? It's nothing much. I saw a mosquito on your head, and I chased it away for you, Zhong Xian replied cheerily. You! Qin's breathing hastened in anger, causing her chest to bounce up and down. Mosquito? Mosquito, your head. We are in the ethereal hall, existing only in consciousness. How could there be any mosquitoes here? Can you at least be any more insincere with your lies? Paying no heed to Qin's rage, Zhongxian turned his attention to the Library of Heaven's Path, and just as he had expected, a book had been compiled. It was filled with Winter Wither's cultivation flaws, as well as a simple introduction about her. Qin, the second daughter of the city lord of Shenjiang City. Zhongxian's lips crept up. While it was possible to conceal one's appearance and identity in the ethereal hall, it couldn't deceive the eyes of the Library of Heaven's Path. In other words, as long as the other party executed a battle technique, the Library of Heaven's Path would be able to compile a book on the other party and peer into all of the other party's secrets. Since it's her, things are going to get exciting then. Zhongxian thought. Turning to He Jianghe, he pointed at Qin and said, "This lass was disrespectful to me earlier. Why don't we do this instead? If you were to lose, not only will you compensate me 100,000 ethereal coins, you will give her to me as a maid too." Chapter 1933. Qin's father Yu. Qin's rage immediately hit the boiling point. She was the second young mistress of the City Lord Manor, a person who was respected and adored wherever she went. To be used as a bet and be asked to serve as another person's maid. This was a grave insult to her. She isn't my subordinate. I have no right to make this decision. He Jianghe replied with a frown. Is it? I guess it can't be helped then. The three fellows who came before you weren't a challenge at all. All it took was one blow, and I can't begin to emphasize just how boring it was. I doubt you would be any different from them. So, let's not waste each other's time and cancel the duel, alright? Zhongxian stretched his back lazily as he spoke. He Jianghe glared at Zhongxian coldly with narrowed eyes as he said, "As a skilled sword practitioner, how can you renege on your words so easily? This woman looked down on me earlier. I feel deeply indignant at her actions, and this leaves me feeling stifled inside. Unless she becomes my maid, I won't be able to take this lying. Given my current state, I don't think that I'll be able to bring out the full prowess of my swordsmanship, which renders this entire duel meaningless. Given how important this matter is, don't you think that it's only right for me to consider it carefully?" Placing his hands behind his back, Zhongxian looked at He Jianghe with his head upright, as if he was doing the latter a favor. "It's not that I want to offend the young lady beside you, but this is for the sake of the duel too. I can't think of a greater insult to one's opponent than to face him in a weakened state. You have approached with utmost sincerity, so I reckon that you would want to face me at full strength instead of defeating me in my weakened state. Such a victory wouldn't reflect well on you either, isn't that so?" Jeji. He Jianghe's knuckles cracked loudly. How in the world was the other party spouting this bunch of bullsh*t without feeling embarrassed in the slightest? If he could, he would really like to give the other party a good pummeling. "So, what you are saying is that as long as I don't accept that bet, I would be bullying you. Even if I win, it would be because I'm taking advantage of you in your weakened state. Senior, you mustn't fall for his cheap provocations." Seeing that He Jianghe was actually starting to rethink the matter, Qin's face paled as she exclaimed anxiously, "You all seem to be making me out to be the villain here. Fine. Even if you don't agree with my request, I'll still have the duel with you, alright? All you want is to defeat me, right? I doubt that you care whether the duel is fair or not anyway." Zhongxian shook his head in desolation. "I guess that's all there is to the pride of the experts of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. They would stoop down to anything as long as they can achieve victory. Enough. I'll accede to your request, is that all?" He Jianghe bellowed furiously. It might seem as if Zhongxian was grasping at straws, but in truth, he had managed to hit He Jianghe's weakness dead on. He Jianghe was someone with a lot of pride, and he couldn't bear the idea of anyone casting doubt over his abilities. "Senior." Qin staggered in shock. She was the second young mistress of the City Lord Manor, a person blessed by the heavens. She was a person who had been accepted into the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and there was a good chance that she could rise through the ranks to become a powerhouse of the continent in the future. It was an unspeakable humiliation for her to actually be used as a wager like that. But barely after she started speaking, she found herself met with Hu Jianghe's cold eyes as the latter uttered frostily, "Do you think that I would lose to the likes of him?" That single glare sent alarm bells ringing in Xue Qin's mind as her face paled in fright. "Oh, of course not. Someone as powerful as you is bound to win him easily." Hu Jianghe grabbed the sword which Xue Qin was holding and drew it out. Fearing that he would die of rage the more he spoke, he stepped onto the dueling ring and said, "Let's hurry up and get it over with." "My thoughts exactly." Zhong Xian chuckled softly as he got onto the dueling ring too. "I heard that you used a sword-tossing technique the previous few times my juniors challenged you. I would like to witness the strength of that technique too," Hu Jianghe said. Since he wanted to salvage the reputation of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, he would have to defeat the other party while the other party was using his most powerful sword art. "Sure." Zhong Xian nodded as he pulled a sword out from the weapon rack. Elder. World's Edge appeared again. In Starlight City's City Lord Manor, Yun Feiyang barged into a room in a hurry. Seated within the room was Elder Lu Yun. Upon hearing the news, his eyes lit up in excitement as he took an ethereal token and immersed his consciousness into it. Yun Feiyang, Huang Dao, and the others quickly followed suit too. As soon as they entered the ethereal hall, they could already hear an amazing bustle coming from where the dueling ring was located. Crowds and crowds of people were rushing over as well. "Let's hurry over. The match between World's Edge and A River's Glance is about to start." A River's Glance? Who is that? I don't know either, but I heard that he's an amazing swordmaster. I have a feeling that it'll be an exciting match. To dare to challenge World's Edge despite knowing his remarkable results earlier the day, it would only mean to say that A River's Glance is no newbie either. I wonder if he would be able to dethrone World's Edge. A River's Glance? Isn't that our first senior? Yun Feiyang's eyes lit up in excitement. "Jianghe is here too? He must have heard of your losses and came here personally to salvage the sect's reputation." Elder Lu Yun nodded in approval as he swiftly deduced what was going on. Those words made the four of them redden in shame. "We apologize for our lack of practice." It was embarrassing that they would need their first senior to stand up for them after their loss. Jianghe has always been a stable fighter, and he has a lot of fighting experience too. I believe that he should be able to undo the negative influence this matter has on our sect. Elder Lu Yun stroked his beard and remarked. Even within the ethereal hall, the character he assumed was also an elder too. Indeed. With our first senior making a move, I believe that not even World's Edge would stand much of a chance at all. Let's head over to take a look. Elder Lu Yun gestured them forward. They squeezed through the crowd and head to the forefront of the commotion, but all of a sudden, deafening cheerings filled the air and tremored the clouds above. "The match must have ended," Elder Lu Yun remarked. They hurried forward, fully expecting to see Hu Jianghe standing triumphantly on the dueling ring. Contrary to what they thought, they saw A River's Glance lying on the ground with a sword impaled in his head instead. It didn't take long for the corpse to dissipate into light fragments. First senior. Yun Feiyang and the others were stunned. Elder Lu Yun was stupefied too. Didn't the battle start not too long ago? Why did it seem like it had ended in the blink of an eye? Could it be that not even their first senior was a match for World's Edge and ended up being killed in a split second too? Meanwhile, Xue Qin's body was trembling non-stop. The situation before her was really driving her mad. Being used as a wager was already displeasing enough for her, but who could have thought that the senior whom she respected so much would actually be subdued by the single toss of a sword? Everything ended so quickly that it almost felt like Hu Jianghe was conspiring with World's Edge to do her in. If that was the case, did this mean that she was now World's Edge's maid? As if having read into her mind, the young man on the dueling ring suddenly called out, "My maid over there, what are you doing over there? Come over and massage my back." "You." Xue Qin felt as if her face was burning up. She had never felt so insulted in her life. "You want me to serve as your maid? Dream on." Xue Qin stomped right onto the dueling ring and raised her hand, intending to slap Zhong Xian in his face. But before her strike could land, The other party's hand had already grasped her wrist. Pa! Sharp pain assaulted Xueqin's face. Instead of the one slapping, she had become the one who had been slapped instead. It was just a single slap, but it was a strike without anything held back at all. Her beautiful face immediately began swelling to the point that her left cheek looked like a huge, red bun. Even though Xueqin knew that this wasn't the real world, the pain and the humiliation she felt were more real than anything she had ever experienced. If there was a pit in the ground right now, she would dive right in without any hesitation. She thought that she would be able to rise to the top with the support of Hu Jianghe and achieve her dreams. But just like a fleeting bubble, it felt as if everything had vanished with a pop. She had never felt so pathetic in her life before. You sure are daring to dare lay your hands on your master. Zhong Xian harumphed coldly. He didn't harbor the slightest goodwill for the vicious woman standing before her. If not for the fact that he was intending on leaving her to his disciple to deal with, he would have already gotten rid of her by now. I'll kill you. Xueqin roared with reddened eyes as she charged forward, intending to pit her life against the young man before her. But at this moment, a cold bellow echoed across the crowd. Enough. Haven't you embarrassed yourself enough? Xueqin's body froze on the spot. Turning around, she saw a middle-aged man walking in her direction. Father. Xueqin muttered softly in a daze. Out of sheer relief upon seeing her pillar of support, the young lady fell to the ground and began crying her eyes out. All of her indignance came gushing out at this moment. She called him father. Could this person be the Lord of Shenjiang City, City Lord Xuegan? City Lord Xuegan is an ancient sage 4-dan dimension Shatterer realm expert. I have never thought that he would come here personally. What would truly unthinkable is him remaining idle after hearing that his daughter has become the maid of another man. If City Lord Xuegan is making a move personally, World's Edge would really be a goner then. Indeed. Not only did he insult Xueqin, he even slapped her. Just on that itself, no one would be able to save him anymore. Paying no heed to the discussions of the crowd, Xuegan looked at Zhong Xian and said, "This friend over here, why don't we call it quits here? It's normal for younglings like you to be hot-blooded, but it would be good to keep it under control. We never know what would happen in the future, so it's better to make friends than enemies, don't you think so?" You're right. How great the world would be if everything could be resolved peacefully. Zhong Xian nodded in agreement. What a pity that we don't live in an idealistic world. Besides, I have no interest in associating myself with dogs. Xuegan's eyes immediately turned livid as killing intent gushed forth from him. The crowd had already revealed his true identity. As the City Lord of Shenjiang City, he was already lowering himself by making peace first, but the other party dared to snub his goodwill. This was intolerable. In truth, Zhong Xian was also nowhere as calm as he seemed on the surface. Were it not for him, the kind Dan Xiaotian could very well be dead by now, and it was all because the latter had a marriage agreement with Xueqin. For the sake of preserving their reputation, there was nothing those two wouldn't stoop down to. He didn't have the patience in him to speak politely to vicious hypocrites like them. You seem to be very confident in your ability. Why don't we have a duel then? Seeing that more and more people were gathering around, Xuegan knew that he couldn't back down just like that anymore. He had to protect his dignity as the city lord. The wager will be 400,000 ethereal coins. Well, it's up to you to decide whether you wish to accept it or not. If you even can't fork out this bit of money, I'll be going back to sleep. It has been a rough day on me, you know. The maid which has just come under me wouldn't heed my orders at all. To be honest, I don't know how you are able to manage a city of millions when you can't even manage your own daughter well. Zhong Xian sighed in disappointment. Since your city lord manor has plenty of money to groom so many soldiers, why don't you bleed some of it out for me? Jeji. Xuegan had never wanted to kill a person so much before. For many years, he had been held in high regard. Even his enemies dared not to talk back to him in his presence. This was the first time he had been put down publicly like this. There was no way he was going to let the other party get away just after all those insults hurled at him. Young man, do you think that the anonymity provided by the ethereal hall is absolute? There are many cases in the world where a person has been hunted down and killed in real life after offending someone in the ethereal hall. Shuegan's voice was dripping with threat. You seem to be very fond of beating around the bush. If you don't have the money to wager, I'll have to ask you to scram. My time is very precious. Zhongxian waved Shuegan away dismissively. You. Shuegan gritted his teeth in fury. Very well, I'll take you up on your wager. To be honest, 400,000 ethereal coins was a huge sum to the City Lord Manor, but if he didn't take up this wager and allowed the other party to leave just like that, the prestige he had built up with difficulty over the past few decades would be eroded just like that. He had no doubt that the other party would surely give everything he had to sully the reputation of the City Lord Manor if he were to back down here. Just how in the world did the City Lord Manor get involved with this troublesome lad? Chapter 1934 Recurring number. Out of regard for their own honor, most experts were very heeding of rules and common courtesy. It had almost become a social convention expected of the higher echelons. However, this lad clearly had no eyes for the rules at all. Knowing that his daughter was the cause of this mess, Shuegan shot a cold glance over at her, causing Xueqin to shudder a little. After which, he turned to Zhongxian and harumphed impatiently, "Hurry up." With a smile on his lips, Zhongxian took his position in the dueling ring and beckoned with a wave of his hand, "You may have the first move. Allow me to make it clear first. Our bet isn't based on the rules of this dueling ring but a life-and-death match," Shuegan said, not anxious to make a move yet. "You can be assured that I'll give you 400,000 ethereal coins if you were to win, but if I were to win, you'll have to tell me your true identity. Furthermore, I want you to come to the City Lord Manor and apologize to my daughter and me. As long as he knew the other party's identity, he would make sure to turn the other party's life into a living hell." "Fine by me," Zhongxian replied haughtily. "Then, shall we put down our bets then?" With a wave of his hand, Shuegan flicked his ethereal card into the hands of the young lady in charge of registration. Wang. There was a brilliant ray of light, and a message surfaced in the air, indicating that Shuegan had put 400,000 ethereal coins into the duel. Seeing how candid the other party was, Zhongxian leisurely flicked his finger and passed the information regarding his identity and location into the hands of the young lady too. 3 was another brilliant ray of light, and words reflecting that Zhongxian had put in his end of the bet appeared in the air too. Even though one's identity in the ethereal hall was anonymous, this anonymity only applied to other cultivators. Through the ethereal token, the system was still able to sense the exact location of the user and verify the user's identity through his blood. Good. Let's begin then. Having confirmed the bet, Shuegan unhesitatingly walked over to the weapon rack and picked up a massive saber. His true field of specialty lay not in his swordsmanship but his saber art. "I won't take advantage of you either. Since you are using a saber, I'll follow you," Zhongxian said as he grabbed an identical saber from the weapon rack too. "He's able to use the saber too? But he's a sword practitioner. Isn't he handicapping himself by equipping a saber?" The crowd was appalled. After 9 remarkable battles, there was no one amongst the crowd who didn't know that World's Edge was a true sword master who could stand his ground even against the disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. And for a sword master to actually wield a saber instead. Was he insane? "You really are courting your own death." Shuegan was confidently in his abilities, but even he was a little hesitant to face Zhongxian's sword toss after seeing how many formidable enemies had fallen before its prowess. But of all things, the other party actually foolishly chose to challenge him to a battle of saber arts. Shuegan couldn't help but scoff coldly. Saber and sword might seem similar, but the vast difference in their sizes and weight meant that they were intended to be wielded in vastly different manners. As such, those who were used to holding a sword often found themselves unable to bring out the true prowess of a saber, and vice versa. It was extremely rare to see someone who had reached the peak in both swordsmanship and saber arts. To forsake your strengths and voluntarily handicap yourself. Very well, I'll make you regret your decision dearly. Hula. With a flick of his wrist, Shuegan immediately flicked his wrist and shot out multiple saber chi. The saber chi adept wrapped itself around Zhongxian's surroundings, sealing the latter's path of movement. At the same time, Shuegan himself dashed forward to bring his saber down upon Zhongxian. Elder Lu Yun's eyebrows shot up. I guess it's not completely without reason that he was able to become the lord of Shenjiang City. This saber art did appear to be ordinary and straightforward on the surface, but Elder Lu Yun could clearly discern that there were 49 transformations in the technique. No matter how Zhongxian moved, Shuegan would have a way to deal with it and press his offense on. Eventually, Zhongxian would find himself cornered and overwhelmed. Even Elder Lu Yun himself would have some trouble coping with such a move. That's City Lord Shue's solace of the Silver Winter. I heard of that story before. It said that back when City Lord Shue was still 27, there was a night in which the silver moon hung beautifully above the snowy fields, seducing all eyes that fell upon it. It was that night which City Lord Shue was inspired to create this ultimate move. Just like the silver moon illuminating the snowy fields, there's nowhere to run or hide from this saber art. It's with this technique that City Lord Shue dominated the dueling ring here. Do you think World's Edge would be able to withstand this move? All of those who had the resources to purchase the ethereal token and enter here were mostly experts. While they were still severely lacking in comparison to Zhongxian, their eye of discernment was at least still on par. They could tell that there was much more to Shuegan's move than what was shown on the exterior, and most of them felt that World's Edge had finally met his match. Not bad. I really should give you some recognition for being able to come up with this move. Similar to the crowd, Zhongxian was slightly surprised by Shuegan's move too. With a deep frown on his forehead, he fell into deep thoughts. Should I use 1/10 of my strength, or should I use 1/5? After all, the person standing before him wasn't the weakling that had come before. He clearly had much more combat experience than the others, though he seemed to have hit his bottleneck. 1/10 might not be enough to block him, but 1/5 was likely to be too great that it might one-hit knockout him. Such fame wasn't what he wanted. If others were to learn that he had the strength to insta-kill even a city lord, there would be no one who would accept his duel and deliver free money to him anymore. Yes, humility and low profile is the way to go. Forget it. I should play safe and start with 1/8 first. I'll first drag the fight for a while before finding a good opportunity to naturally defeat him later on. Zhongxian quickly made up his mind before charging forth with his saber. His moves were neither glamorous nor profound. In his hands, the saber seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet, as if an impenetrable barrier, he was able to fend against Shuegan's relentless offense each and every time. In the blink of a few eyes, they had already traded 20 blows. Elder Lu, who do you think will win? Yun Feiyang, who didn't have much understanding of saber, asked. The rest of the gang quickly turned their heads over as well. I reckon that City Lord Shue is in an advantageous position. Elder Lu replied with a wise nod. So, City Lord Shue is going to win? Most likely so. While World's Edge has managed to stand his ground so far, it's apparent that he isn't as adept with the saber. This is the reason why he has been forced to be on the defensive thus far, unable to launch a proper counterattack against City Lord Shue. On the other hand, City Lord Shue's saber balances speed together with strength perfectly. Each move he makes results in more momentum building up within the saber, and it would eventually reach a level that overwhelms World's Edge defense. Elder Lu replied calmly as he stroked his beard. Those who were qualified to become a city lord and could hold on to the position for so long were bound to possess extraordinary abilities that surpassed the others. I see. Yun Feiyang and the others nodded in realization. Analyzing the duel from Elder Lu's perspective, the happenings in the duel suddenly made sense to them. Meanwhile, on the dueling ring, it felt like a snowstorm had descended upon the world, sending chilling air into the surroundings. With each strike, City Lord Shue's movements were growing faster and faster, such that cracks started to appear on the dueling ring. Incredible. Zhongxian nodded in excitement. He was already using 1/8 of his strength, but Shuegan was still able to tightly control the flow of the battle through the sheer strength of his technique. In fact, it would likely still be a prolonged battle even if he were to use 1/7 of his strength. He would have to at least use 1/6 of his strength in order to guarantee a swift victory. This was probably the strongest expert he had encountered ever since he arrived on the Azure. It had only been a day since he had regained consciousness after all. In any case, This was a good opportunity for him to try his skills. While Zhongxian was getting more and more high on the battle, the horror in Shuigan's eyes gradually deepened. Just like what the others had said, the saber art he was executing at the moment was indeed the solace of the Silver Winter. This technique allowed him to retain the momentum of his previous swings to heighten the might and speed of the subsequent attacks. As long as he had sufficient time to build up, he would become the berserker of the battlefield, tearing down everything in sight. But things didn't seem to be going in the direction he had expected today. He thought that he would be able to defeat the other party once he had compounded his strength and speed to his limits, but who could have thought? The young man was growing stronger and stronger throughout the battle. His hand had already been jolted numb by the sheer strength of his swings, and the webbings in between his fingers were bleeding profusely. I'll end this fast. The slow build-up in his injuries would hinder his fighting prowess, and that would present a chance to World's Edge to turn the tables on him. Knowing that he mustn't allow this battle to drag any longer, Shuigan decided to go all out. With a furious roar, he drove his saber forth. Wung wung. All of the saber chi he had sent at Zhongxian earlier swiftly gathered together to form a massive tornado. The true prowess of Solace of the Silver Winter lay not in the compounding strength of his saber strikes but the lingering saber chi in the area with each move made. If he were to gather all of the saber chi together, he would be able to launch a devastating strike far beyond his current limit. Struggle all you will, but your defeat is already sealed. Shuigan sneered at Zhongxian coldly, though his heart was beating wildly on the inside. This is his ultimate technique. Seeing that the other party's moves had become more powerful, such that it would be hard for him to keep up even with a sixth of his strength, Zhongxian sighed deeply as he made up his mind. Forget it, I'll use that same move too. After giving it some thought, he still felt that the Heaven's Path saber art that he had practiced was too powerful. So, with a light flick of his finger, the saber in his hand shot across the air. The technique works on sabers too? Yun Feiyang and the others were stunned. They could tell that the young man was intending to toss his saber just like how he had tossed his sword at them. But would it really work out? The weight and shape of a saber and sword were different from one another, and the slightest difference could mean the largest difference in the outcome. Was it really all right? Before their doubts could blossom, the saber whooshed across the air with a choking sound. Hula. It took only an instant for it to appear before Shuigan. With a reddened face, Shuigan hurriedly raised his saber to block against it, only to realize that his strike had landed empty. Puha! The saber pierced right through his head. Even though Shuigan was defeated in that instant, by the sheer strength of his willpower as a Dimension Shatterer realm cultivator, he was able to keep himself from dissipating into light fragments for a brief moment. You were already able to defeat me right from the start? Shuigan stared at Zhongxian with eyes so wide that they were almost bulging out. He had long heard the rumors that the other party was skilled in tossing swords. He thought that the reason why his opponent hadn't thrown his weapon at him was because of his inability to execute the technique with a saber. But his assumption didn't hold true. His opponent was able to do the same with a saber, and with utmost ease at that. The tossed saber was so powerful that he was unable to deflect it even with all the momentum he had built up thus far. If his opponent had used it right from the start, he wouldn't have been able to last so long at all. In other words, his opponent had only been playing with him thus far. Everything he had done must have looked nothing more than a farce to the other party. You have forked out 400,000 ethereal coins for this duel. Wouldn't it be a huge pity if you were to lose in a single move? I thought that it would give you more value for money by dragging out the duel a little for you. Zhongxian confessed in embarrassment. Pu. Fresh blood spurted out of Shuigan's lips. Value for money, your head? If you really want to give me more value for money, you should at least say that you have used your full strength. To reveal that you have been going easy on me all along, am I supposed to thank you for that? Shameless humble bragging. I'll admit my defeat, but it's clear that you didn't use your full strength either. I would like to know how much of your strength did you use? Using his last breath, Shuigan asked. The fact that the other party was able to keep up with him despite the increasing strength and speed of his saber likely meant that the other party had been matching his fighting prowess. Given so, he couldn't help but wonder just how powerful the other party was. How much strength did I use? Zhongxian pondered for a moment, but eventually, he decided to reveal it honestly. You aren't much of a person, but at least you weren't too shabby of an opponent. You were able to make me bring out 0.16666666666. Well, you get the idea of recurring numbers, right? Chapter 1935 The Cultivation Realms in the Azure. What? Shuegan was stunned. I asked you how much of your strength did you exert, but what the heck are you doing giving me such a long string of 6? Peng. Unable to stand it any longer, Shuegan's body finally dissipated on the spot. The surroundings were completely silent as the eyebrows of the crowd leaped around the place. They didn't think that World's Edge was speaking the truth either. Otherwise, how the heck did he go down to so many decimal points? There was no one in the world who could possibly control their strength to such a fine extent. And what the heck are recurring numbers? Recurring your head? Can you conduct yourself more like an expert? While the crowd was rolling their eyes at World's Edge, Xueqin's face had already paled completely from fear. She could still understand why Hu Jianghe lost to World's Edge. After all, the latter was still young and hadn't fully unleashed his potential yet. However, her father was the lord of Shenjiang City, an ancient sage 4-dimension Shatterer realm cultivator. In terms of comprehension of cultivation and mastery of battle techniques, he had already reached an incredible level even when compared to the experts of Starlight City. Yet, he was still unable to defeat World's Edge when their cultivation was at the same level as one another. Just when in the world did this fellow pop out from? How could he be so powerful? If there were really such a figure in Starlight City, he should have already made a name for himself by now. At the very most, I'll just stay out of the ethereal hall over the next few days. I don't believe that he would dare make a fuss at the City Lord Manor. If he does so, he'll just be courting his own death. Xueqin clenched her fists tightly as she made up her mind. What made or not made? As long as she didn't enter the ethereal hall, what could the other party do about her? While World's Edge had managed to outmaneuver and defeat her father here, she didn't think that World's Edge would actually be stronger than him. Reassuring herself as such, Xueqin felt as if the boulder weighing down her heart had finally been released. Who? There was a flash of light before her figure vanished from the spot. How weak-minded are you lot? Why bother asking for the truth when you can't take it? Zhongxian shook his head helplessly and sighed. He could tell from the looks on Shuegan and the crowd's face that no one believed him at all. As a perfectionist, if he said he was going to exert a sixth of his strength, he would really exert exactly a sixth of his strength, which would be equivalent to 0.1666666. He was being perfectly honest over here, but no one would just believe him. It sure was hard to be a good person in this world. Sighing deeply, Zhongxian walked down from the dueling ring and headed to the registration counter. He first destroyed the object which contained information regarding his whereabouts and identity before passing his ethereal card over. As Hu Jianghe had died with Xueqin's weapon in his possession, the item was automatically sold back to the system and the sum was deposited into Zhongxian's card. With that, he had a total of 600,000 ethereal coins in his card. He quickly traded his money for a good storage ring, and just as he was about to leave the ethereal hall, a person whom he had once defeated on the dueling ring, Soaring Cloud, walked over with a name scroll in hand. Elder World's Edge, Elder Lu from our sect wishes to meet you privately. May I know if it's a convenient time for you now? Elder Lu? Zhongxian murmured. Considering that Soaring Cloud was from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, wouldn't that mean that the Elder Lu whom he was referring to was an elder in the sect? Very well. With this thought in mind, Zhongxian nodded his head without much hesitation. A person who could become an elder in one of the 6 sects was bound to know quite a lot about the Azure. This was a good opportunity for him to learn about the various powers in the Azure, especially the Spirit God Palace. During his time at the otherworldly battlefield, through Wu Chen's sacrifice, they summoned a deity from the Azure, and the latter said that she would reveal Luo Ruoxin's whereabouts to him if he could reach the Spirit God Palace. This was currently the greatest clue he had to find Luo Ruoxin. Following behind Soaring Cloud, they soon arrived in a tightly sealed room. Aside from officiating duels, The ethereal hall also had special locations that allowed cultivators to converse privately with one another. Privacy was absolutely guaranteed in these private chambers. No matter one spoke inside these rooms, those who were outside would not hear a single word of it. There was already an old man seated at the center of the room. There were 4 people standing behind him, 4 of whom Zhongxian recognized to be challengers he had already defeated on the dueling ring. With awkward looks on their faces, neither of them seemed willing to meet Zhongxian in the eye. Surprisingly, a river's glance was amidst the group of 4 too. It seemed like he had found a new ethereal token and got back in. As soon as Zhongxian walked in, Elder Lu Yun immediately stood up and introduced himself politely. I am an external elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, Lu Yun. It's my pleasure to meet you, Elder Lu. Zhongxian clasped his fist and greeted him. I am World's Edge. As the other party's motives for inviting him over weren't clear, he was reluctant to reveal his true identity just yet. While he was confident that there would be no one who would be able to best him in the ethereal hall, back in the real world, his strength as an ancient sage 4-dan dimension Shatter Realm cultivator would only be enough for him to dominate the small Shenjiang city. Moving up to Starlight City and beyond, there were bound to be many experts who wielded powers far beyond him. There's no need to restrain yourself before him. The fact that World's Edge had chosen to introduce himself by his nickname instead of his real name told Elder Lu Yun that the other party was still wary of him. With a gentle smile, he said, I have already watched the videos of your duel with them. Your comprehension of swordsmanship has truly reached a formidable level. However, if I'm not mistaken, you have already hit a bottleneck in your swordsmanship. For someone of your level, advancing further than where you are is no easy feat. You will need resources and guidance in order to do so. If you remain as an unaffiliated cultivator, it's highly likely that you'll never overcome your current bottleneck. So, I would like to extend my sincere invitation to you to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. One's swordsmanship often reflected one's personality. What Elder Lu Yun felt formed Zhongxian's swordsmanship was decisiveness, so he decided to get straight to the point. You wish to invite me to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? Zhongxian was half convinced that Elder Lu Yun was calling him over in order to teach him a lesson, so he was a little caught off guard when the latter extended such an invitation to him. Hu Jianghe and Shui Gan are not a match for you at the same cultivation realm. Given your level of expertise in swordsmanship, you are already able to apply for the role of an inner disciple as soon as you enter the sect. As an inner disciple, you'll be entitled to access advanced sword arts, and there will be plenty of fellow sword practitioners whom you can spar and trade insights with. I believe that you'll be able to grow at a much faster pace than you currently are. Just on the account that Zhongxian could defeat the first senior of the outer disciples so easily meant that he was already qualified to join the ranks of the inner disciples. I'm afraid I'll have to think the matter over carefully. Zhongxian didn't give a response right away. The Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion was one of the major powers in the Azure, and if he could borrow their connections to look for Luo Ruoxin, things would likely be much easier and more convenient for him. However, this was a give and take. In return for receiving the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion's goodwill, he would have to repay them with his loyalty. However, he had no interest in getting involved with the politics among the 6 sects, and he didn't want to get involved in their affairs either. It would likely be a whole string of trouble if he chose to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Of course. This is a huge matter, so I don't expect you to give me an answer right away. Elder Lu Yun nodded in response. Elder Lu, there are some questions which I would like to ask you. I hope that I am not overstepping my boundaries over here. Zhongxian looked at Elder Lu Yun as he spoke. Of course not. Please feel free to speak. May I know if you have ever heard of a place known as the Spirit God Palace? Zhongxian asked nervously. Spirit God Palace? Elder Lu Yun pondered deeply for a moment before shaking his head. I'm afraid I have never heard of such a place before. I see. Zhongxian looked at Elder Lu contemplatively for a moment as he replied. A slight tinge of disappointment could be heard in his voice. I am just an external elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. My duties lay mainly in guiding the younger disciples, so I'm afraid I'm not as knowledgeable about the other affairs on the continent. However, Our sect does have plenty of books that study the relationships and various powers on the Forsaken Continent. As long as you are able to obtain clearance, you will be able to browse through them. I believe you should be able to find what you want in there. Elder Lu Yun was flustered for a split moment, but he swiftly regained himself and replied calmly. Even though he was honored as one of the elders of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, the truth was that he was of the lowest tier. He didn't have the right to access privy information and learn more about the matter. Given that the Spirit God Palace which the other party spoke about carried the word God in it, it was likely to involve something greater. Someone of his level wouldn't be able to know about it. I understand, Zhongshen nodded. Considering that the other party was an external elder tasked with the responsibility of recruiting menial and outer disciples, it was indeed unlikely that he would have too deep of an understanding regarding the secrets of the higher echelons. Oh, there's also another question which I would like to seek enlightenment to. I know that cultivation realms are Saint, Great Sage, and Ancient Sage, but I am curious to know what lies beyond that, Zhongshen said. The highest realm of Ancient Sage is Dimension Shatterer Realm, and beyond that would be Pseudo-Immortal Realm. Pseudo-Immortals are invulnerable to flames, and their souls are as pure as true gold. With their thoughts, they are able to make things happen. I am currently at Pseudo-Immortal Realm, and the same goes for the Lord of Starlight City as well. Pseudo-Immortal Realm can be divided into 4 stages, namely Lesser Pseudo-Immortal, Greater Pseudo-Immortal, Earthly Pseudo-Immortal, and Heavenly Pseudo-Immortal. Above the Pseudo-Immortals are the True Immortals. True Immortals are considered as real experts on the Forsaken Continent, and most elders in the 6 sects are at this level. Those who manage to take a step further from there and transcend to greater heights are known as High Immortals. They are also termed as the King of Immortals. Only the core elders of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion has reached this level. At this point, Elder Lu Yun paused for a brief moment before continuing on. Well, these are the realms that I know. The heavens are boundless, so I have no doubt that there is something beyond the high immortals, but that's not something I am privy to know about anymore. Cultivation is not easy. It's hard to go too far without powerful backing, and cultivation resources are simply too limited in the world. Just take this for example, the questions you have just asked are common knowledge amongst ordinary disciples, but you had to specially ask me to find out about it. Ancient Sage, Pseudo-Immortal, True Immortal, and High Immortal. Zhongshen nodded as he jotted those realms down in his head. With your swordsmanship and my recommendation, I have no doubt that you'll be able to become an inner disciple with ease. May I know where you are at the moment? If possible, I think it would be better for both of us to sit down in person to have a chat about this. After all, this matter is of grave importance to your future, Elder Lu Yun said. In the end, no matter what was discussed here, it would be all but empty agreements. He had to meet the person in person in order to know how powerful the other party was, whether he was a guy or a girl, or even whether he was a human or a beast. I am currently at Shenjiang City. I believe we'll eventually meet one another if you were to come over. Besides, I think that I might have something which I need to trouble Senior Hua over there for, Zhongshen said with a mysterious smile. You are at Shenjiang City? Elder Lu Yun subconsciously shot a glance at Hu Jianghe as doubts surfaced in his mind. There was actually such a powerful expert at a place as backward as Shenjiang City. As long as it's within my abilities, I'll try my best to help you. Hu Jianghe clasped his fist and said. He could tell that Elder Lu Yun was determined to bring World's Edge into the sect. As such, while he wasn't too fond of World's Edge himself, he knew better than to throw a tantrum here. Well, it's like this. Zhongshen discreetly sent a Zhenqi telepathy to Hu Jianghe, and at the end of which, he clasped his fist and bowed. I'll be troubling Senior Hua on this matter then. I still have some matters to attend to at the moment, so I won't impose on you all any longer. Farewell. After finding all he wanted to know, Zhongshen didn't linger in the private room. He returned back to the front reception of the ethereal hall and asked, May I know if there's anything here that would allow a cultivator to recover his strength quickly? If you are an ancient sage cultivator, you could try low-tier immortal pills. It costs 100,000 ethereal coins each, the receptionist replied. Even a low-tier one costs 100,000 ethereal coins? It was as if the ethereal hall couldn't get enough of shocking Zhongxian with how exorbitant its goods were. He felt like the entire organization was out to rob every single one of those ethereal coins that he earned painstakingly. Being indignant consumer Zhongxian was, he immediately inquired into the exorbitant price, and it turned out that the pricing was perfectly normal here. Basically, immortal pills were treated as the currency in the upper echelons of the azure because of how general its use was. There was no cultivator who wouldn't need it, so the demand for the good was relatively stable. In a sense, it was similar to the spirit stones of the master-teacher continent. Immortal pills could be divided into 4 tiers. Basic immortal pills corresponded to pseudo-immortals, standard immortal pills corresponded to true immortals, and superior immortal pills corresponded to high immortals. As for premier immortal pills, it was so rare that it would be difficult to buy it off the market even if one had the money for it. Not too many people have seen it before. Given that it was a currency used mainly for the higher echelons, as well as an important cultivation resource for pseudo-immortals, it was understandable that its pricing would be a little steep. Nevertheless, if he had to spend 100 ethereal coins for each of them, the little fortune that he had just earned would really be gone in an instant. Zhongxian used his remaining money to buy a basic immortal pill before looking at the receptionist curiously. If I may ask, it appears that the ethereal hall sells all kinds of goods. Does it sell cultivation technique manuals and the sort as well? Of course, the attendant nodded. However, the cultivation techniques that we have are those commonly practiced on the continent. As for the core cultivation techniques of the 6 sects, I'm afraid that it's beyond our means too. There was no way the 6 sects would allow their cultivation techniques to be leaked. Even if the ethereal hall had copies, they would swiftly face the wrath of the 6 sects if they dared to put them on sale. If it was just dueling and interaction, the 6 sects would still allow for the existence of the ethereal hall in the world. After all, there was no conflict in their interests. However, if the ethereal hall dared to threaten their foundation, it would be an all-out war. It was also for this reason that the ethereal hall was able to grow so big over the years, with branches spanning across the entire Forsaken continent. I understand. I'm fine with common cultivation techniques too. If I were to just browse through the cultivation techniques for a short moment of time instead of purchasing them, how much would it cost? Zhongxian asked in agitation. While he had achieved a breakthrough to Dimension Shatterer Realm, he was unfortunately limited by the fact that he didn't have any cultivation techniques in the realm itself. If he could just browse through the collection of cultivation technique manuals here, as long as he had sufficient basic immortal pills, he was confident that he would be able to reach pinnacle within a few hours. That would make it easier for him to navigate around the Forsaken continent and find Luo Ruoxin. There are pricing differences depending on the tier of the cultivation techniques. 4-dimension Shatterer Realm cultivation techniques, the most basic ones would cost at least 50,000 ethereal coins each. Also, I'm afraid that our cultivation techniques are for sale only. We don't offer browsing services here. 50,000 ethereal coins for the most basic cultivation technique manual? Zhongxian's lips twitched in horror. He was still thinking of buying a huge bundle of them if they were inexpensive, but who could have thought that the price would be so horrifying? Based on rough estimation, he would probably need over 1,000 ordinary books in order to compile a perfected Dimension Shatterer Realm Heaven's Path Divine Art. That would equate to 50 million ethereal coins. Even if he were to tire himself to death on the dueling ring, he wouldn't be able to earn that much. Besides, he had just harvested a new group of challengers. He had no idea when the next group of challengers would be ready for his harvesting. It seemed like purchasing cultivation technique manuals here for his advancement was really not too feasible. Do I really have to join a sect? Zhongxian rubbed his forehead in exasperation. Chapter 1936 Capture. Each of the 6 sects was bound to have their own libraries containing innumerable cultivation techniques. Zhongxian would surely be able to gather thousands of books over there easily. It was due to such readily available resources in there that so many cultivators desired to join the ranks of the 6 sects. Just like what Elder Lu Yun had said, with his comprehension of swordsmanship, it shouldn't be too difficult for him to become an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. In fact, he would probably be able to join any of the 6 sects easily, and he was confident that he could rise through the ranks easily. However, there was no such thing as a free lunch in the world. Joining a sect meant that he would have to adhere to the rules and regulations of the sect. If it was just a few trivial rules here and there, it still wouldn't be too much of a problem. However, if one of the rules somehow prevented him from looking for Luo Ruoxin, or that the sect was hostile toward the spirit god palace, he would really be shooting himself in the foot then. Wait. What if Dan Xiaotian joins the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and I follow him as his servant? That should work as well, right? Zhong Xian's eyes lit up in excitement. It was said that there would be a selection in Zhenjiang City 2 days later for cultivators to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion as menial disciples. If Dan Xiaotian were to display sufficient talent, he should be able to get in as an outer disciple. Most outer disciples were assigned with servants to take care of their necessities. So, as long as Dan Xiaotian succeeded, he should be able to get into the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion as well. Once he was in, he could adapt accordingly to the situation to acquire what he needed. At the same time, he could supervise his disciples' learning and ensure that he didn't stray down the wrong path. Not to mention, as a servant of an outer disciple, he was a character so minor that he wouldn't be officially recognized by the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, which also meant that he wouldn't be bound by its rules too. That was 3 birds with a stone. It's settled then. Zhong Xian gave the matter some more thought and confirmed that there were no major problems with this course of action. Heaving a huge sigh of relief, he left the ethereal hall. While Zhong Xian had made up his mind, Elder Lu Yun and the others in the private room had come to a decision as well. We have to head to Zhenjiang City right now. Let me see. It's a little past midnight now, and with the fastest aerial beast we have, we should be able to arrive in the afternoon. Since that's the case, let's not delay it any further and conduct the selection in Zhenjiang City today then. Jianghe, I want you to send down the announcement to those in Zhenjiang City that we'll be conducting the selection today as soon as dawn breaks. There's no need to wait for us, understood? Nothing must go wrong with this. We have to find World's Edge by hook or by crook. Elder Lu Yun instructed sternly. Yes. Hu Jianghe replied with a nod. Bringing back such a talented genius was far more significant than taking in 100 above-average outer disciples. If he were to allow World's Edge to slip past his fingers, and World's Edge ended up joining some other sect instead, he would surely be severely punished for his lapse in responsibility. As for the rest of you, pack up your things right now. We'll be setting off in 5 minutes, got it? Who? All of them vanished from the ethereal hall swiftly. Returning back to his room, Zhong Xian quickly activated the ethereal token to claim the storage ring and basic immortal pill he had just purchased. The basic immortal pill had a slightly silvery color, and it was densely packed with the pure Mercury-like spiritual energy. Just taking a whiff of it was enough to leave one's meridians trembling in agitation, as if encountering an oasis in a desert. Knowing that it was of utmost importance to him in recovering his strength, Zhong Xian swallowed the pill without any hesitation. As soon as he ingested the basic immortal pill, he felt a warm flow of energy gushing into his limbs. The pure Mercury-like energy was swiftly being converted into concentrated zhenqi. In the midst of his cultivation, Zhong Xian couldn't help but realize that the zhenqi he had formed from the Mercury-like spiritual energy was much more powerful. Due to its greater density, the techniques he executed with it were much mightier. While the capacity of his dantian hadn't changed, the quality of the zhenqi he was taking in was much greater. This meant that he was capable of bringing out much greater prowess in a battle than before. It was no wonder why the experts in the Azure were so extraordinarily powerful, such that he could only barely scrape a victory after using all of the means at his disposal. Not only was the Mercury-like spiritual energy able to enhance one's constitution, it also played an important role in tempering one's zhenqi. After cultivating for some time, the energy harnessed in the basic immortal pill was finally all used up. Exhaling deeply, Zhong Xian slowly opened his eyes. While the basic immortal pill was rich in energy, it was still insufficient for him to make a full recovery. From the looks of it, I reckon that I would need another one in order to fully recover. Zhong Xian murmured. If he needed 2 basic immortal pills just to recover his strength, Just how many of it would he freaking require in order to make a breakthrough? Cultivating was really a money-sucking abyss. No matter how rich one was, it would never be enough. Zhongxian glanced at the windows and found that it was already dawn. As soon as he walked out of the room, he saw that Dan Xiaotian was still carefully practicing his swordsmanship. Despite having not rested for a night, Dan Xiaotian's movements did not reflect any exhaustion. If anything, his movements were much more stable, and he was able to drive his zhenqi much more smoothly now. Not bad. I see that you have worked hard. With just a glance, Zhongxian could tell that Dan Xiaotian had followed his instructions strictly, not slacking off in the least. In truth, he didn't ask Dan Xiaotian to practice his swordsmanship just to punish him. He had just achieved a breakthrough of 6 realms in the span of a day, and this abrupt breakthrough inevitably meant that his mind and reflexes would be unable to keep up with his newfound power. As such, he needed sufficient practice in order to fully adapt to the changes in his body. While practicing the same move again and again for thousands of times was extremely monotonous and grinding on one's patience, it was an essential step for Dan Xiaotian to precisely discern the flow of zhenqi in his body. This would allow him to sharpen his control over his strength, thus gradually breaking him into his newfound powers. And clearly, his aim had been achieved. In a night of practice, Dan Xiaotian had already fully adapted himself to his current Great Sage 3 Dan cultivation. Teacher. Hearing the opening of the door, Dan Xiaotian quickly walked over, kneeled down, and greeted Zhongxian. He was no fool either. He could clearly sense the changes in his body, so how would he not understand his teacher's intention? Alarmed by this huge reaction, Zhongxian quickly reached out to help Dan Xiaotian up. But at this moment, there was a sudden jolt in his head. A golden page appeared in the library of Heaven's Path. It seemed like it was only at this moment that he had truly won Dan Xiaotian over as his disciple. This means that I'm able to acquire golden pages in the Azure too. This is good news. Zhongxian thought in delight. He thought that the differences in the environment might hinder some of the functions of the Library of Heaven's Path, but fortunately, that didn't seem to be the case. The golden page represented a crucial trump card. As long as he had it in his grasp, he would have nothing to fear for now. How far have you gone with the sword art I have imparted to you? Show it to me, Zhongxian said with a smile after helping Dan Xiaotian up. He had taught Dan Xiaotian the sword toss technique he had created yesterday in the ethereal hall, and he was curious to see how far his disciple had come with this technique over the night. Yes, teacher. Dan Xiaotian took a few steps back before flicking his wrist lightly. Su. His sword flew across the air. While the speed of his toss wasn't on par with Zhongxian's, it was still fast enough to produce numerous afterimages in his path. In the blink of an eye, the sword pierced into the trunk of a nearby tree, and all of a sudden, the huge tree exploded, creating a huge crater in where it previously stood. Not bad. You have already reached the level of an initiate. If you wish to further your mastery in the art, you should try practicing it in battle. Observe your opponent's flaws carefully before making your move. If you could reach the level where you are able to discern multiple openings in your opponent's move with a single glance, you will have reached major accomplishment in this technique. By then, none of your peers would be a match for you anymore, Zhongxian said. This sword toss appeared to be a simple move, but it harnessed the crux of the Heaven's Path sword art within it. As long as he was able to find a flaw in the movements of his opponent, no one would be able to block it. It was precisely for this reason that Hu Jianghe and Shui Gan were completely helpless before it. Yes, teacher. Dan Xiaotian nodded in agitation. After a night of practice, he had also come to realize just how powerful and profound this single sword toss was. Everything he had learned before was really nothing in comparison. He felt almost as if he had been living in a pineapple under the ocean all this while. All right, I'll impart to you some other sword arts too. Learning more sword arts would be beneficial in widening your perspective, thus granting you a deeper insight into your swordsmanship. This is crucial in your advancement as a sword practitioner, Zhongxian said. Just as he was about to impart some elementary sword arts to Dan Xiaotian, a flurry of footsteps suddenly sounded outside. Jia. The entrance was knocked open, and 10 armored soldiers rushed into the courtyard and swiftly surrounded Zhongxian and Dan Xiaotian. Who is the owner of this residence? The commander standing at the forefront asked coldly. He was a young man in his 30s, but despite his young age, his cultivation had already reached ancient sage 1 Dan blood continuation realm. I am the owner of this residence. Noting that the group that had barged in were guards from the City Lord Manor, Dan Xiaotian walked forward with a frown. Men, capture him, the commander ordered. Voila! 2 guards immediately rushed out from behind with drawn swords in their hands. Their faces reflected belligerence that indicated that they wouldn't hesitate to hurt Dan Xiaotian. I advise you not to retaliate. We do have the discretion to kill criminals who attempt to resist arrest, one of the 2 guards sneered coldly as he approached Dan Xiaotian with chains in hand. What crime did I commit? Dan Xiaotian was taken aback by the situation before him. Yesterday night, the sentries of the City Lord Manor found the bandit Cao Chengli sneaking into the city with his band. It was clear that he was up to no good, so the City Lord Manor immediately dispatched a group of 50 elites to eliminate them. However, those 50 never returned. After investigating the matter the entire morning, we found that the footsteps of those 50 elites led straight to your residence. Thus, I have obtained an arrest warrant from the City Lord Manor to arrest you on the ground of colluding with bandits to kill our men, the commander sneered coldly. Dan Xiaotian widened his eyes in shock for a moment before exclaiming furiously, colluding with bandits? That's nonsense. I would never do something like that. Yesterday night, if not for his teacher, he might have been killed by those bandits. Yet, these guards actually claimed that he was colluding with them. You must be joking with me. In his view, even the chances of the City Lord Manor colluding with the bandits were greater than his. It's fine, I don't expect you to admit to it either. Men, bring the evidence over. The commander bellowed with a wave of his hand. Voila! Several guards immediately marched forward and tossed the items in their hands over. It was a bunch of blooded and soiled weapons and armor. We found these around your residence. There are the weapons of the bandits and the armor our guards. It's apparent that they have clashed with one another here, and someone has intentionally concealed the evidence. What else do you have to say for yourself? The commander harumphed. This. How could this be? Dan Xiaotian was stunned. His teacher had already gotten rid of everything yesterday, so how could there still be such stuff lying around? Those weapons and clothes are indeed from the bandits living in the mountains outside. It was robbed by them several times while shipping my goods, so there's no way I would mistake it. Those armors are definitely from the City Lord Manor too. They patrol around my place every day, so how could I possibly get it wrong? How could he stoop so low to colluding with bandits? Despicable. We have to punish such behavior severely. Right, we should also force them to confess their ploy as well. If the bandits had really succeeded in achieving whatever they set out to do, who knows how many casualties there would be in our city. The Dan clan sure has fallen from its former glory. I was still feeling sympathetic to their plight, especially given that their final remaining member isn't able to cultivate at all, but it turns out to those who are pitiful have a reason for being in the plight they are in. Colluding with bandits. It serves them right to be destroyed like that. Before Dan Xiaotian could explain, a bunch of notable figures in the city suddenly sprouted forth from behind the soldiers. Merchants, tavern owners, medicinal herb peddlers, tea house owners. These were the people who propped up the lifeline of Zhenjiang City's economy. They had been harassed by bandits many times in the course of conducting their businesses, so they had the greatest say in the matter too. What else do you have to say for yourself? The commander sneered. Turning to his guards, he commanded, grab him and bring him to the City Lord Manor. Make sure to interrogate him properly. Voila! The guard holding on the chain began advancing toward Dan Xiaotian once more. All of you are shameless. The upright City Lord Manor actually wants to. Dan Xiaotian was just about to lash out furiously when he suddenly halted his words. There was a moment of silence before he nodded. Fine, I'll follow you to the City Lord Manor. I hope that you can redress my grievances. I trust that you will uncover the truth and punish those who are truly guilty of this. Mph, let's go. The commander appeared to be a little disappointed to see Dan Xiaotian complying with him so easily. He shot a glance at the crowd before saying, The act of colluding with the bandits threatens the peace of our city. Given how severe the implications are, as well as the fact that you have been harmed by Cao Chengli before, I would like to invite all of you to follow me to the City Lord Manor to testify in the court. At the same time, this is to ensure that the proceedings are fair and impartial, and we would not side with Dan Xiaotian just because he's engaged to the second young mistress. Very well. The crowd nodded in agreement. Chapter 1937 The Art of Framing. The rest of them are likely to be accomplices as well. Capture them and bring them to the City Lord Manor too. The guards quickly handcuffed Zhongxian and Elder Yi before leading them out of the residence. Zhongxian didn't resist the arrest. Instead, he sent some more instructions over Dan Xiaotian, and the latter visibly calmed down upon hearing those words. With a hunched back to make him appear smaller, he limped his way out of the Dan clan residence. His cultivation was also concealed through a certain method which his teacher had just imparted to him. In the eyes of others, he was no different from an ordinary Saint 6 Dan cultivator. After leaving the Dan clan residence, they were escorted into a carriage, and it didn't take long for them to arrive at the City Lord Manor. At this moment, the City Lord Manor was already completely packed. There were over 1,000 people present discussing the issue concerning the bandits worriedly. Clearly, Xuechen's plan had worked out. The City Lord Manor is also very worried about the bandits entering the city. After careful investigation, we found that the Dan clan has a hand in this matter as well. As you know, Dan Xiaotian is engaged to the second young mistress. Thus, in order to ensure impartiality, we'll be holding a public trial so as to allay your fears that we might be biased in our judgment. Xuechen spoke up to calm the crowd. As expected of the City Lord Manor, they sure are efficient to root out the culprits so quickly. Those who collude with the bandits deserve to die. I thought that Dan Xiaotian looked quite honest, but it seems like a wretched heart is concealed beneath his honest face. When Dan Xiaotian was finally escorted into the court by the guards, everyone swiftly hushed down. There was almost no one in the city who didn't know of the engagement. However, the very act of colluding with the bandits was a vile and unforgivable act. Countless lives could have lost if anything had gone wrong. Thus, they wanted to see if the City Lord Manor would still maintain its impartiality even when judging someone close to them. After Dan Xiaotian limped into place and was forced to kneel down, Xuechen glanced at the guards and ordered, "Bring in the evidence." Several guards immediately rushed in and placed the blooded armor, bows, and arrows on the ground. Following this, a well-groomed middle-aged man walked into the court and said, "Lord, I have already inspected every article here, and the bows and arrows are indeed used by Cao Chengli and the others. There are clear signs that it had been used by them. As for the armor, there is no doubt that they are the ones used by the guards of the City Lord Manor too, and judging from the freshness of the blood, they were left on the armor last night." Another person stepped forward and added on, "Lord, I can also testify to this matter. While I was cultivating last night, I heard some movements outside. I secretly peeked through my windows and found many black-clothed individuals sneaking toward the Dan clan. It does seem like they are conducting some kind of transaction between them." Dan Xiaotian shot a glance at the testifying witness, and he recognized the latter to be from a neighboring family not too far away from the Dan clan residence. They were usually on close terms with one another. "Lord, I saw it too. There were several dozen people, and I couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. Thus, I recorded the entire scene." Another person stepped forward too, and he was Dan Xiaotian's neighbor as well. That person activated his record crystal, and the video taken down was displayed before everyone's eyes. Beneath the night of full moon, a group of black-clothed bandits was silently sneaking into Dan Xiaotian's residence. After they entered the premises, there was no commotion. There was only absolute silence, as if the owner of the residence had implicitly permitted their presence. I was still wondering if there were some other secrets involved in this issue, but to think that it's actually true. But why would Dan Xiaotian collude with the bandits? I also found that weird too. The Dan clan might be declined, but Dan Xiaotian should still be able to live an ample life with the riches his predecessors have left behind. There shouldn't be any reason for him to take such a risk. A huge commotion broke out after the video in the record crystal was displayed. Those who knew Dan Xiaotian's character and thought that there might be some conspiracy involved in the issue stared at the young man kneeling at the center of the court with a look of disbelief in their eyes. The Dan clan had its roots from Baiye City, but they had moved to Zhenjiang City several decades ago. Over the years, it grew swiftly, and it eventually reached its peak 10 years ago, becoming an unrivaled power in Zhenjiang City. Back in that era, there were countless experts in the Dan clan. Just the three-dimension Shatterer realm experts that they had was enough to frighten any enemy into submitting to the Dan clan. Not even the City Lord Manor would have dared to make an enemy out of the Dan clan then, choosing to make peace through a marriage agreement instead. Everything had changed after that unfortunate incident that caused the deaths of nearly all of the experts of the Dan clan. The fortunes of the Dan clan were swiftly devoured by others shortly after. Nevertheless, it still held substantial wealth due to its massive accumulation over the years. There was no reason for it to collude with the bandit. As such, most of the more rational-minded individuals amongst the crowd found the matter inexplicable. Second young mistress. Just as everyone was harboring doubts, hurried footsteps suddenly echoed from afar. Raising their heads to take a look, the crowd saw the second young mistress of the City Lord Manor, Xue Qin, rushing over with an anxious look on their faces. This sight left bizarre looks on the faces of the crowd. Considering that the marriage agreement between Dan Xiaotian and Xue Qin, it was only right for Xue Qin to stay out of this trial so as to avoid hindering the impartiality of the trial. Yet, she actually rushed out just like that. Sprinting behind Xue Qin were the maids of the City Lord Manor. They had flustered looks on their faces, as if they didn't expect the second young mistress to act so recklessly as to barge into the trial. Why? Shaking away the grasp of the maids trying to hold her back, Xue Qin stared at Dan Xiaotian with reddened eyes, as if she was unable to accept the latter's betrayal. We have been engaged to one another since a young age. While you have become unable to cultivate, I have never snubbed you before and treated as per before. This time, the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion has come to our town to recruit disciples. I thought that it was an opportunity for us, so I worked hard to win Senior Hua's approval to become a menial disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. I was thinking that I could obtain even better herbs for you to recover from your affliction so that you can cultivate once again and rebuild the glory of your Dan clan. Xue Qin shook her head melancholically, disappointed by the betrayal of her loved one. I thought that you would be proud of me, so I sent my men to inform you of the matter. Yet, why did you collude with the bandits to stop this from happening? You even kidnapped me and had the bandits beat me up, attempting to force me to change my mind. Did you think that I would forget you just because I got into the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? I'm doing this not just for myself but for our future. This would have been the key to changing our fates. As Xue Qin spoke, the tears brimming in her eyes began trickling down. She averted her gaze from Dan Xiaotian, as if she couldn't bear to look the man in the eye anymore. So, it was because the second young mistress has cleared the selections for the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and that had crushed Dan Xiaotian's self-esteem. Thus, he chose to collude with the bandits to stop it from happening. Dan Xiaotian is truly foolish. Does he not know that there are many enemies of the Dan clan out to kill him, and the only reason why he can live to this day is due to the City Lord Manor and the second young mistress protection? Or perhaps, it was because he realizes the fact that he worries about what would happen to him once the second young mistress leaves. That's why he chose to make this risky move, hoping that he could retain the second young mistress here. As long as the second young mistress goes missing, she wouldn't be able to enter the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion anymore once those from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion left. With that, as long as he seals the marriage as well, his safety would be guaranteed. No one would dare to touch him anymore. Everything makes perfect sense now. That explains why the second young mistress' face is slightly swollen. She must have suffered quite a bit under the bandits' captive. That must be the case. Who else would dare to lay their hands the second young mistress of the City Lord Manor? Those group of bandits would dare to do anything as long as one pays them enough. If not for his carelessness, no one would ever think of suspecting Dan Xiaotian. He really has thought things out carefully. Hearing those accusations, everyone nodded in realization as they turned to look at Dan Xiaotian once more with looks of disgust on their faces. A young lady had done so much for you, but you don't know the slightest thing about gratitude. Can you still call yourself a human after what you did? She would have won an Oscars back in my previous world. Zhong Xian was about to fall asleep from boredom when the second young mistress entertained him with such a marvelous performance. With such a few words, she had managed to evoke the emotions of the crowd and win their sympathy. With such acting skills, he would have surely blamed the judging panel for under-the-table dealings if she hadn't won a prize. It was human nature to sympathize with the weak and women, not to mention a person as beautiful as Xue Qin. All it took was some rousing words and a few tears to establish an emotional connection with the crowd. Initially, the evidence and witnesses presented wouldn't have been enough to indict Dan Xiaotian of his crimes. After all, most of what was presented was circumstantial, and there was no clear motive that would justify his involvement. Who in the right mind would collude with the bandits to act against the City Lord Manor for no reason? But with even Xue Qin testifying against him as well, the odds were way against Dan Xiaotian's favor. Even the City Lord Manor wouldn't be able to back down from this anymore. They would have no choice but to bow down to the will of the people and sentence Dan Xiaotian. And this conveniently explained why the second young mistress had been accepted as a menial disciple into the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion even prior to the official trial. With this, not only was Xue Qin's reputation not sullied in any way, she would even be praised as a strong and sentimental lady. On the other hand, Dan Xiaotian would have become a jerk who snubbed the Xue Qin's kind intentions and even attempted to harm her. This would provide the City Lord Manor with the required justification to annul the engagement. It was indeed a remarkable scheme with many layers to it. An ingenious ploy from a true villain indeed. On the other hand, Dan Xiaotian was on the verge of exploding from rage. I have agreed to cancel our engagement, but you were unsatisfied with just that and wanted to trample all over me so that you can walk out of it cleanly. When I rejected that, the first thing you thought of is to kill me instead. And when that failed too, you tried to pour dirty water over me to frame me of something I have not done. There really is nothing you wouldn't use against me. Second young mistress, don't waste your tears on a person like him. He isn't worthy of that. Seeing that they had managed to pull the crowd sentiment to their side, Xue Chen knew that his plan had already succeeded. At this point, no matter what else Dan Xiaotian said, he wouldn't be able to salvage the situation anymore. Heaving a sigh of relief on the inside, he consoled Xue Qin before ordering the maids beside her. What are the two of you waiting for? Hurry up and bring the second young mistress back. Yes. The two maids quickly escorted the crying Xue Qin out of the court. Xue Chen finally his head back to Dan Xiaotian, and with a frosty look in his eyes, he said, with the evidence in place, what else do you have to say for yourself? Knowing that whatever he said would be meaningless at this point, Dan Xiaotian calmly looked back at Xue Chen and said, so, based on what you all have said so far, it's out of my low self-esteem that I was jealous of Xue Qin for clearing the trial of the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion. Thus, I sought to collude with the bandits in order to stop her from going over. Are you acknowledging your intentions? Or do you still intend to argue your way out of this even when there is an overwhelming number of evidence and witnesses testifying against you? Xue Chen sneered. Acknowledging my intentions? Dan Xiaotian shook his head and sighed a little, as if he couldn't be bothered to argue with someone of the likes of Xue Chen. I wish to meet Senior Hu Jianghe from the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion. Audacious. Who do you think you are to dare ask for an audience with Master Hu? Xue Chen thought that Dan Xiaotian would raise the matter about them attempting to annul the marriage agreement previously. Regarding that, he had already prepared a countermeasure that would have the latter cornered in a single move. But instead of that, the other party was asking to meet Senior Hu instead. Why? I am indeed unqualified, but I heard that the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion is accepting menial disciples. As long as one clears their trial, one would be able to join them. As someone from Shenjiang City and is of suitable age, I believe I have a right to participate in the trial too, right? Dan Xiaotian said. Anyone of Shenjiang City would stand a chance to become a menial disciple of Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion, but you, Dan Xiaotian, don't stand a chance at all. I don't know what you are trying to pull here, but the City Lord Manor is answerable to the citizens of Shenjiang City. With the vile deeds you have committed, there's no way the City Manor will condone your crimes. Hearing those words, Xue Chen immediately burst into laughter, as if he had heard the greatest joke in the world. A Saint Six Dan trash actually wanted to participate in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion's trial? How in the world did he find the courage to say something as ridiculous as that? Besides, do you think someone as important as Master Hue would specially conduct the trial for a trash like you? Xue Chen continued. He really doesn't know his place at all. All those who are allowed to join the trial are the greatest talent of our Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. That fellow is a cripple and can't cultivate. Does he want to make our city a laughingstock in the region? Master Hue is busy selecting the true geniuses from our city. How could he possibly have time to assess a cripple like him? He must have knocked his head somewhere. Derisive laughter could be heard from amongst the crowd. You better drop whatever thought you have in your mind. There's no way Master Hue would come here to test a trash like you. I advise you to confess to your crimes, and we can at least spare you from some suffering. Xue Chen bellowed loudly. But halfway through his words, a composed voice suddenly echoed from the courtyard outside. Why can't I be here to conduct the trial for him? A tall figure walked into the court with widened strides. Hu Jianghe. Chapter 1938 Turning Tables. There was a middle-aged man walking behind Hu Jianghe. This middle-aged man had a tall silhouette, and he was donned with majestic armor. His eyes emanated imposing authority, reminiscent of a person in power. Xue Qin had been slowly walking away so as to listen to the proceedings when she heard the voice as well. Turning her head around, she was stunned for a moment before bowing deeply. Father. Senior Hue. The middle-aged man was no other than the person who was killed by Zhong Xian with a single toss of saber back in the ethereal hall, the lord of Shenjiang City, Xue Gan. There were 10 or so young men following behind the two. They were in their early teens, roughly 16 to 17 years old. Despite their young age, they seemed to wield incredible might in their grasp. They were the examinees participating in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion's trial. Master Hue. Upon seeing the two, Xue Chen turned a bewildered look to City Lord Xue Gan. As the trial of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion was of utmost importance, as the City Lord, Xue Gan was required to be present at the venue to supervise the event. Yet, who could have thought that barely after the preliminary selection was completed, Hu Jianghe suddenly insisted on heading over to the City Lord Manor's court. This had left Xue Gan bewildered too. We'll conduct the second round of selections here. I can see that there are many people present here to witness the proceedings, and I believe that it would be good to showcase the fairness of our trial. Hu Jianghe arbitrarily made the decision himself as he walked right up to the centermost position in the room. If it was any other situation, it would be a breach of formalities for Hu Jianghe to make this decision on his own accord, especially given that City Lord Xue Gan was present here. However, while this trial was underway, his words would represent the will of the entire Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. As such, even Xue Gan had no choice but to accept his judgment. On the other hand, seeing that the court proceedings were suddenly interrupted in such an unexpected fashion, Xue Chen was stunned. What was he supposed to do now? Senior Hue, I am a citizen of Shenjiang City as well. May I know if I am qualified to join the trial as well? Dan Xiaotian asked with a resounding voice. Of course. Hu Jianghe nodded. Master Hue, Dan Xiaotian is a mere Saint Six Dan cultivator. It would be a waste of time for you to invigilate someone of his caliber. Furthermore, he colluded with the bandits to harm the interests of the city. It would be an insult to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion if someone as vile as him was permitted to participate in the trial as well, Xue Chen said anxiously. He knew that Dan Xiaotian wouldn't be able to clear the trial even if he were to participate in it, but it would undermine the legitimacy of the trial if Dan Xiaotian were to suddenly participate in the trial as well. Furthermore, he could tell that Dan Xiaotian had something up his sleeves, and while he was confident of his plan, he knew better than to allow Dan Xiaotian to get his way. You are saying that I'm weak? Dan Xiaotian looked at Xue Chen and asked. Of course. As a crippled Saint Six Dan, Your strength can't even compare to the ordinary civilians of our city. What else can you be other than weak? Xue Chen's eyebrows shot up. Since that's the case, I would like to ask what's your opinion of Xue Qin's abilities then? Dan Xiaotian asked. Even though the situation was still against him, confidence seemed to be slowly building up in his voice. Initially, he was just timidly obeying whatever Zhongxian told him to do and say, but in face of Xue Chen's oppression, his words were slowly becoming firmer and more powerful. Our second young mistress is, of course, a genius. Despite only being 16 this year, she has already reached Great Sage 3 Dan consummation, and she could very well achieve a breakthrough anytime soon. Xue Chen replied proudly. Is that so? Dan Xiaotian replied calmly. Wong wong wong. Bursts of sword qi shot out from the tip of his fingers, slicing the handcuffs around his wrist into shreds in an instant. At the same time, Dan Xiaotian released the seal on his cultivation, causing the aura around him to grow stronger and stronger till the equivalent of a Great Sage 3 Dan consummation expert. His hunched back also slowly straightened, causing his perceived 1.6 meters height to rise to that of around 1.75 meters. While he wasn't as tall as Zhongxian, he appeared much more dignified than before. More importantly, when he slowly walked forward, the limp in his leg had vanished without a trace as well. Even his appearance seemed to have undergone some changes. Despite the glaring birthmark on his face, his features became more defined and elegant, giving him a masculine undertone. This is impossible. Xue Qin's eyes nearly plopped to the ground. All along, she had viewed Dan Xiaotian to be synonymous with weak and useless. She never thought that he could undergo such a huge transformation one day. Paying no heed to the shocked Xue Qin, Dan Xiaotian walked straight up to Xue Chen. His lips curved upward as he asked, even though the two of us have the same cultivation realm, you think of me as a trash but Xue Qin as an unparalleled genius. I really wonder how you came to a judgment. Do you think with your toes? You. Xue Chen shook his head in disbelief as he took a step back. When had this fellow become able to cultivate? Not to mention Great Sage 3 Dan consummation? It wasn't just them. The crowd had fallen completely silent as well. The previous motive they had attributed to Dan Xiaotian was based on the premise that he was unable to cultivate, such that he needed the support of the city lord residents in order to survive. However, if Dan Xiaotian was actually an expert himself, such a reason would be invalidated. All of you should come at me together, Dan Xiaotian told the youths that had come with Hu Jianghe with a light chuckle. You want to fight all of us at once? These youths were startled by the suddenly challenge. They turned to look at Hu Jianghe, and the latter gave a slight nod of approval. Thus, they raised the swords in their hands and charged forth. On the other hand, using his finger as his sword, Dan Xiaotian jabbed forth and snatched the sword from the hands of one of the cultivators. With the sword in his hand, he easily deflected the offense coming from the others. Tzzzzzzzzzz. Numerous surges of sword qi shot out from the tip of Dan Xiaotian's sword simultaneously. While he had spent most of his time deciphering the sword toss technique his teacher had imparted to him, he didn't neglect to work on his foundations as well. Even without using his trump card, his fighting prowess was still one to be reckoned with. Dang lang, dang lang, dang lang. With the outburst of sword qi, the swords that the other youths held were knocked out of their hands, falling to the ground amidst metallic clatter. The youths couldn't help stare at Zhongxian in horror. The sword art which Dan Xiaotian had executed actually disarmed all of them in an instant. It was fortunate that he had gone easy on them, or else it could have been their wrists that were severed instead. Who? With a flick of his finger, the sword in Dan Xiaotian's hand flew out and stabbed into the ground right in front of Xue Qin. With an air of loftiness, he looked at Xue Qin and asked, May I ask if the talented second young mistress is able to do what I, a trash, am able to do? The crowd fell silent. Under the encirclement of over 10 opponents, Dan Xiaotian was able to steal a sword and knock out the swords in the hands of the others without even taking a step. The strength and swordsmanship he had displayed were truly terrifying. If such a person was considered as a trash, what would they count as? Xue Qin's face paled as her body trembled in fear. Even though she was a Great Sage 3 Dan consummation cultivator, She knew that she would definitely be incapable of such a feat if she were to attempt to do the same. She had little doubt that she would be overwhelmed in an instant and fall in defeat. Xue Chen was silent for a moment before he swiftly rebutted, "Even if you aren't a trash, it's a fact that you have colluded with the bandits. Even your own neighbors have stepped forward to testify that they have spotted bandits entering your residence in the middle of the night." Hearing those words, Dan Xiaotian turned to look at the two witnesses and asked, "Are you certain that you have witnessed with your own eyes that there are bandits entering my residence?" "Yes. There's no mistake about it. We have seen it for certain." Under Dan Xiaotian's piercing gaze, the two neighbors cowered fearfully a little. If Dan Xiaotian was still unable to cultivate, they would still have nothing to fear. But given the prowess that Dan Xiaotian had just displayed, they couldn't help but recall the imposing authority that the Dan clan commanded 10 years ago. Even though they were just revealing what they had seen, just the possibility that Dan Xiaotian could exact vengeance on them in the future for this made their words sound much less confident than before. While their hearts were thumping fearfully, Dan Xiaotian spoke out, "The fact that you saw it means that you are very sharp-eyed." Huh. The two neighbors were stunned. Sharp-eyed. Boy, do you know what you are saying? That's equivalent to admitting that you have colluded with the bandit. No matter how talented and powerful you are, there's no way the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion would accept a person who has moral issues. As though a rock had been thrown into a pond, a huge uproar broke out amidst the crowd in that instant. Ha 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 ha. Look, Dan Xiaotian has finally admitted to his crimes. Since that's the case, I believe we need not continue on with the interrogation anymore. Men, capture that scoundrel who dares to collude with the bandits and lock him up. Xue Chen was also stunned for a moment before his eyes lit up in ravenous joy. From the moment that Dan Xiaotian revealed his true prowess, he knew that things had gone awry. If Dan Xiaotian were to vehemently refute their claims from then on, it would have been a very difficult fight for him. The fact that they had chosen to hold a public trial was a double-edged sword to them. They would have to find conclusive evidence in order to indict Dan Xiaotian, or else the reputation of the City Lord Manor could be sullied as a result of this matter. Yet, who could have thought that Dan Xiaotian would foolishly admit to the matter at this moment? Not to mention, in front of so many people at that. With this, Dan Xiaotian's fate was sealed. Just by this confession in itself, they would be able to push for Dan Xiaotian's execution. "Aren't you being too hasty over here? I didn't know that the City Lord Manor has a habit of jumping to conclusions." Dan Xiaotian sneered coldly. Turning to Hua Jianghe, he clasped his fist and asked politely, "Senior Hua, I would like to summon an eyewitness to the court." "Go ahead." Hua Jianghe nodded. "Come in." Dan Xiaotian glanced outside and ordered. A figure covered tightly in a black robe and a straw hat walked from the midst of the crowd. Standing at the center of the court, he slowly took off his hat. "His Cao Chengli. You mean the leader of that band of bandits? He actually dares to walk right into the City Lord Manor? How dare he? Kill him." "He's the eyewitness that Dan Xiaotian is summoning. It seems like the two of them are really colluding with one another." Upon catching a closer look at the silhouette, the crowd went completely frenzied. The person who had just entered was no other than the leader of the bandit band, Cao Chengli. This fellow's hideout was hidden in the depths of the mountain forest, and he was extremely skilled at navigating around the complex geography. As a result, the previous attempts by the City Lord Manor to apprehend him fell empty. Yet, he actually dared to walk right into the City Lord Manor. Just who in the world gave him the guts to do so? Is everyone seeing this sight? Cao Chengli is actually heeding Dan Xiaotian's word. It's obvious that they are in collusion. Xue Chen was so excited that he nearly leaped into the air. Everything that had been presented thus far was just speculations and circumstantial evidence. Yet, that fellow actually brought the leader of the bandit band right in. Was there a worse move that one could make in this situation? Collusion. Dan Xiaotian suddenly roared in laughter as he looked at the black-robed bandit. Why don't we hear from the person in question who he was truly colluding with? It's him. Cao Chengli stepped forward and pointed to Xue Chen and Xue Qin. She was involved in it as well. What nonsense are you spouting? Don't you dare spout falsehood in this sacred place of justice. Xue Chen's eyebrows shot up and he swiftly denied Cao Chengli's claims. Spout fossed. Cao Chengli's fists clenched tightly together from rage. He turned to the crowd and began recounting his story loudly. Yesterday night, Xue Chen paid me a visit and requested that I kill a man for him. As long as I successfully assassinated the target, he would pay me a handsome sum of 50,000 ethereal coins. I did a bit of investigation and found that the person I was intending to assassinate is a weakling, so I swiftly agreed to his request. Assassination? Weakling? There were plenty of smart individuals amongst the crowd who had already roughly guessed what had happened, and their eyes swiftly turned to Dan Xiaotian. In recent years, those were the words that had been used far too often to refer to him. Indeed, the target of assassination was no other than Dan Xiaotian. Cao Chengli answered the doubts of the crowd. So, I prepared an ambush for him last night, but Dan Xiaotian turned out to be much stronger than I thought, resulting in the failure of my assassination attempt. My entire band of bandits was slain by him. It would simply be too shocking if he were to say that his subordinates were killed by a horse and a carriage. Since that was the case, it would be more viable for him to spin up a more believable lie. It was out of sheer luck that I managed to escape with my life. I immediately went to meet up with Xue Chen, and I demanded compensation from him for his inaccurate information that led to the deaths of my subordinates. Yet, he only paid me 500 ethereal coins. Infuriated, I followed him all the way back to his place, hoping to uncover his identity, but what I saw instead was Xue Chen entering the City Lord Manor, and that was when I finally deduced his true identity. Furthermore, by sheer coincidence, I managed to record this scene down on a record crystal. Please have a look, Cao Chengli said as he began playing the record crystal he had recorded the previous night. The video reflected the courtyard of the tightly guarded City Lord Manor. The first thing that came into sight was a huge group of soldiers standing in a neat formation. Under the commands of a middle-aged man, Xue Chen, standing at the forefront of the formation, these soldiers stripped their armor and donned the clothes of the bandits. After they had all changed into black garments, Xue Chen emphasized imposingly that Dan Xiaotian and those around him must be killed by hook or by crook in this operation. Chapter 1939 Elder Lu arrives. The video didn't just stop there. The person recording the video followed the suspicious dressed soldiers as they snuck across the streets, all the way to Dan Xiaotian's residence. That video is extremely alike to the one that was played earlier. It's likely that they were taken at the same timing. I thought that they were really bandits due to the clothes they were wearing, but who could have thought that they were actually the guards of the City Lord Manor? Wait a moment. Doesn't this mean that the guards of the City Lord Manor intentionally disguised themselves as bandits to murder others? It didn't take long for some to notice that the scene reflected in Cao Chengli's video was similar to the one displayed earlier, just that they were taken from different angles. Due to the dress-up, they instinctively assumed that those black garment individuals were bandits, but it turned out to just be a cover. They were actually the guards of the City Lord Manor, who? The video stopped right after the guards entered the Dan clan residence. Taking the record crystal back into his grasp, Cao Chengli looked at Xue Chen and asked, "What else do you have to say for yourself?" "You. That's fabricated evidence." Xue Chen's face paled in fright. He never thought that someone would follow him and record this sight down. Fabricated evidence? You sure speak as if it's that easy to fabricate such evidence. Why don't you try making one for us? Cao Chengli spat. It was impossible to alter the content recorded by a record crystal, and the presence of corroborating evidence from the neighbors recording further proved the authenticity of Cao Chengli's recording. Xue Chen's face paled as he took a step back. This is all utter nonsense. You are engaged to the second young mistress, and given how talented you are, why should we kill you? Isn't it foolish for the City Lord Manor to take such a course of action? Xue Chen's argument does make sense as well. The crowd quickly turned their heads over to Dan Xiaotian, wanting to see how he would explain himself. Considering that the two of them had a marriage agreement with one another, it should be a blessing for the City Lord Manor that Dan Xiaotian was actually a genius. Taking a step back, even if Xue Qin and Dan Xiaotian had some disagreement with one another, they could have just annulled their agreement. Did the City Lord Manor really have to go to the extent of killing Dan Xiaotian? This didn't seem too rational to them. You are asking me why you want to kill me? It seems like your memory really isn't too good. Maybe this will help jot your memories a little. Dan Xiaotian chuckled as he took out a record crystal too and played the video stored within. You know the reason why I am coming here, but instead of coming out to welcome me personally, you dispatched a lowly servant to send the marriage agreement over instead. Do you think that this matter can be resolved that easily? In the video, Xueqin's attitude was cold and haughty, as if she had her head in the clouds. What I want from you isn't much. I just need you to announce to the entire city that you were the one who chose to back out of the marriage agreement on your own accord because you feel that you aren't worthy of me. It's after a series of careful deliberation before my father finally decided to respect your opinion and end the marriage agreement. By giving me the mere sheet of paper, are you expecting me to tell everyone that I, Xueqin, refuse to marry you? How could I allow the noble city lord manor to have such a stain on its reputation? Well, it's very simple. Over these years, the Dan clan has offended quite a few people, isn't that so? You should also know that if not for your engagement with Xueqing, you should have already died many times over. Xueqin sneered coldly in the video. How would your death affect the city lord manor's reputation? Let me see. Our city lord would be enraged to learn of your demise, and he would dispatch men to exact vengeance for you. As for our second young mistress, she would be in deep sorrow for a long time, and eventually, she would decide to depart from this land of grief and head to the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion. The record crystal displayed the haughty attitudes of both Xueqin and Xueqin clearly, be it their words, their expressions, or their gestures. It turned out that she wanted to annul the engagement, but she wasn't satisfied with the other party rejecting her. In order to preserve her reputation, she would stoop down to even killing him. What a venomous heart she has. The reputation of the City Lord Manor has remained pristine over the years, but who could have thought that they would conduct such vile acts beneath the surface? How embarrassing. I have never felt so embarrassed to be a citizen of Zhenjiang City before. There was no one who didn't understand what was going on after watching the video. Their eyes gradually turned hostile as they shifted their gazes toward Xueqin and Xueqin Yu. With a pale face, Xueqin felt as if her strength had receded from her body, causing her to slump to a heap on the ground. She thought that everything would be settled after this. She would be free from the trash, and her reputation would soar as well. But things ended up in a direction she hadn't expected. Everything that she did was exposed so blatantly in public. From this day on, her reputation would be completely shattered. Everyone would only remember her as the cold-hearted woman who would stoop to colluding with the bandits in order to murder her fiancé in cold blood. Who would dare to marry her with such a reputation to her name? If such a matter could happen to Dan Xiaotian, how could they guarantee that they wouldn't be next? A bunch of nonsense. Today, I'll teach you a lesson for daring to fabricate lies about the City Lord Manor. Xueqin roared furiously as he abruptly charged at Dan Xiaotian and Cao Chengli. With a powerful gust of wind, his palm struck forth with impressive might. After everything that had happened, Xueqin knew that he had been cornered. In such a scenario, the best thing he could do was to silence Dan Xiaotian and Cao Chengli. Only with their death would he be able to start salvaging the situation. With his ancient Sage 3 Dan cultivation, he swiftly sealed everything within the room. In that instant, both Dan Xiaotian and Cao Chengli felt as if a ravenous wolf had set its sights on them, and it left them trembling from instincts. Audacious. Hu Jianghe's eyes turned cold in fury. He didn't think that Xueqin would dare to kill those two in his presence. It seemed like the other party was really looking down on him. Hu Jianghe immediately grasped his sword, intending to stop Xueqin, but in the next instant, he felt a palm pushing his hands down, preventing him from unsheathing his sword. He glared at the person beside him, only to see City Lord Xuegan looking at him with a composed smile. Master, there's no need to worry. Xueqin is just scaring the two of them, he won't really make a move on them. As a disciple of the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion, it would be beneath you to get involved in the affairs of our city. Those words made Hu Jianghe narrow his eyes frostily. There was no way he could mistake Xueqin's killing intent. It was definitely not a bluff but a true strike to kill. If that palm were to land, the two of them would be killed on the spot. After those two were eliminated, City Lord Shuegan would step forward and express his regret at failing to keep his subordinate in line. He would then imprison Xue Chen until the matter finally died down. By then, Dan Xiaotian and Cao Chengli would already be dead, so who would dare to question the City Lord Manner's judgment over two dead men? And once everything blew over, Xue Chen would be released as if nothing had happened at all. No. In the face of Xue Chen's devastating palm strike, Cao Chengli's face paled as sweat washed down his forehead. He had only come to redress Dan Xiaotian's grievances under the orders of that mysterious book. He had no intention of losing his life here. Just as he thought that his fate was sealed, the imposing momentum that was headed his way suddenly dissipated without a trace. Fearfully raising his head to take a peek, he saw the ancient sage 3-dan expert in front of him collapsing powerlessly to the ground. Echa! Alarmed, Cao Chengli warily approached Xue Chen, only to see a small piercing from his forehead to the back of his head. He carefully placed his fingers in front of Xue Chen's nostrils, only to realize that the latter had already breathed his last. His fingers immediately jerked back out of shock. He was dazed for a moment before he began frantically looking around for the murder weapon. However, the only thing he found was a mysterious stalk of grass stabbed into the ground. There were traces of grayish matter on the stalk of grass. As unbelievable as it may seem, it seemed like it was the weapon that had robbed Xue Chen of his life. For a flimsy stalk of grass to pierce through the head of an ancient sage 3-dan cultivator. Just how powerful must one be to achieve such a feat? The comprehension that there was a powerful expert around who could take his life at any moment filled Cao Chengli's mind with utmost horror. His body stiffened in fear, not daring to move in the least. On the other hand, Hu Jianghe rose to his feet as he looked upon the scene in disbelief. He was an ancient sage 4-dan primary stage expert just like City Lord Shuegan, but even he knew that he would be unable to pull off something like that. The flimsy structure of grass prevented one from exerting significant strength through it or infusing zhenqi into it. Yet, it actually breached an ancient sage 3-dan's zhenqi protective layer and pierced through his head. More importantly, even though the matter had happened right before his eyes, he was actually unable to discern who the culprit was, or where the grass had come from at all. It was almost as if the stalk of grass had appeared out of nowhere. City Lord Shuegan was as shocked as Hu Jianghe was, and he felt his body turning icy cold. He knew that if he had been in Xue Chen's place, that strike would have ended his life with ease as well. The only one present in the court that wasn't surprised was likely only Dan Xiaotian. He heaved a sigh of relief as he thought, "My teacher is truly formidable." He knew that his teacher was an extraordinary cultivator, but he didn't think that he would actually be this powerful. Suppressing his agitation and astonishment, Dan Xiaotian was just about to continue speaking when he saw City Lord Shuegan rising to his feet with an indignant look on his face. How dare Xue Chen commit such atrocities? To think that I have trusted him and entrusted him with the important position as the chief instructor of the City Lord Manor. I must have been blind back then. This is truly a huge disgrace. Such black sheep must be killed in order to send out a stern warning to the others. Dan Xiaotian was taken aback by Shuegan's sudden outburst. Was the latter claiming that he was the one who had killed Xue Chen? Just how shameless could that fellow get? Xiaotian, I apologize for the suffering you have been through as a result of Xue Chen's willful actions. It's fortunate that you are smart enough to undo his ploy, or else our City Lord Manor would have fallen into disgrace as well. Shuegan walked over to Dan Xiaotian, and assuming the role of a caring elder, he said with a warm voice, "Your engagement with my daughter was decided by your grandfather and my father. They might be gone now, but as their offspring, we cannot let their expectations down. I believe that the reason why Xue Qin committed such foolishness is because of Xue Chen's beguilement. That fellow has always been skilled at manipulating the hearts of others." Dan Xiaotain couldn't help but sneer upon seeing how swift Shuegan was adapting to the situation. As expected of the city lord, Shuegan was a wily old fox. It was only because his teacher valued his privacy that he didn't want to step forward in this situation. Of everything that was gathered here, the one who boasted the greatest strength was Shuegan, so it was only natural that everyone thought that he was the one who killed Xue Chen. Making use of this mentality, Shuegan immediately pushed all blame onto Xue Chen, making it sound as if the City Lord Manor wasn't involved in the matter at all. After this matter blew over, he would then placate everyone with a mixture of fear tactics and incentives, so the public sentiments against the City Lord Manor would die down soon enough. Nevertheless, to be able to cast away his loyal subordinates so quickly, Shuegan sure was a callous man. City Lord Shuegan, you sure are a good jester. Dan Xiaotian chuckled a little before his eyes suddenly turned utterly cold. The 50 elites dispatched by the City Lord Manor has died overnight, and a huge investigation was carried out right after. Are we to believe that this was all orchestrated by Xue Chen without your knowledge? The death of 50 elites was a heavy cost to the City Lord Manor. There was no way Shuegan would have been completely oblivious to the matter. While there were various smart individuals amongst the crowd who had already figured out as much, Dan Xiaotian's act of pointing it out candidly could be considered as a direct challenge toward the City Lord Manor. Not expecting Xue Chen to continue harping on this matter even though he had already proposed a peaceful resolution, Shuegan's face turned livid. He immediately sent a warning to Dan Xiaotian via Zhenqi telepathy. Is Xue Chen's death not enough for you? Are you intending to bring me down as well? Naive. Do you even have evidence to prove that I was involved in this matter too? Dan Xiaotian fell silent. While Xue Qin's attitude had been awful, it was true that most of the ploys were planned and executed by Xue Chen. As a result, there was no direct link to indicate that Shuegan had played a part in it as well. In fact, it was likely that even Xue Qin would be able to shirk responsibility off her too. After all, what she had mainly done was just to annul their engagement. Her actions thus far might have been reprehensible from a moral standpoint, but it didn't infringe on the law. Unless he could prove that Xue Chen was acting under Xue Qin's commands, he wouldn't be able to indict her under any crime. If you don't have any evidence, I advise you not to run your mouth. I know that you have a formidable expert backing you, and that's why you were able to kill Xue Chen so easily. However, I am the Lord of Shenjiang City, and this is a title conferred to me directly by the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Only the elders of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion have the right to judge me. If the expert behind you dares to lay a hand on me, that could be interpreted as intervening in the internal affairs of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Do you think that the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion would allow someone who challenged their authority to get off scot-free? Or do you think that the person backing you have the ability to withstand the pressure coming from one of the 6 sects? Shuegan sneered. If you don't want the person backing you to get in trouble while trying to help you, I advise you to obediently heed my words and let this matter go. That would be the perfect ending, wouldn't it? Your marriage with Xue Qin will go on as planned, and you need not worry about the Dan clan's enemies either. Dan Xiaotian's eyes reddened in fury, but he was unable to speak a word at all. In truth, he had also guessed as much that City Lord Shuegan had played a huge role in the incident that resulted in the deaths of his family back then, and he had been wanting to exact vengeance too. But what Shuegan said made perfect sense too. Through proper channels, none of them had the right to judge Shuegan. And if his teacher were to dare make a move on Shuegan privately, that would be no different from falling out with the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. While his teacher was powerful, he didn't think that his teacher was strong enough to stand against the entire Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Even if I don't say anything more, I believe you should know what you have to do, right? Seeing that Dan Xiaotian was beginning to waver, Shuegan harumphed coldly. In case you foolishly think that you still stand a chance, allow me to reiterate this fact for you once more. Unless an elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion hears your prayer and appears right now, otherwise you'll just be digging your own. Who? Before Shuegan could finish his words, the resounding call of a beast sounded from the air. Several individuals descended from the sky right after. Elder Lu. Upon seeing this group of people, Hu Jianghe's eyes lit up, and he swiftly rushed forward and clasped his fist. Elder Lu had finally arrived here from Starlight City. Seeing this sight, the words that Shuegan had wanted to speak ended up clogging inside his throat instead. Chapter 1940 The Trial of Inner Disciples. While Elder Lu Yun was in charge of only managing the outer disciples, there was no denying that he was a real pseudo-immortal realm cultivator. Originally, he was only in charge of the outer disciple trial in Starlight City. He wouldn't have even come to a place like Shenjiang City where only menial disciples were recruited. Unless there were exceptional circumstances, he would only pass by the area at most. So why would he suddenly drop by at this moment? Shuegan couldn't believe what he was seeing, but he dared not to show the slightest disrespect toward Elder Lu Yun either. Thus, he quickly rushed forward and bowed down. City Lord Shuegan pays respects to Elder Lu Yun. Yuan, Elder Lu Yun waved his hands casually before turning to Hujianga. How is it? Has he appeared yet? Elder, I'm still uncertain exactly who that person is, but my guess is that he has something to do with that young man over there, Hujianga said as he gestured toward Dan Xiaotian. Yesterday night, while he was still at the ethereal hall, World's Edge had asked him for a favor, requesting him to appear here at this timing. In the end, there was indeed a court case happening here, and it was due to his presence that Dan Xiaotian was able to redress his grievances. Thus, even if Dan Xiaotian wasn't World's Edge, it was likely that he was related to him in one way or another. Him? Elder Lu Yun looked at Dan Xiaotian doubtfully. With his eye of discernment, he could instantaneously tell how powerful Dan Xiaotian was. Great Sage 3 Dan consummation. A person of such cultivation was actually able to kill all of his disciples with ease. It's like this. Hujianga began recounting everything that had happened to Elder Lu Yun. After hearing the story, Elder Lu Yun's face darkened. To think that there would be someone who would dare to act so audaciously in the territories of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. There was no way he could let this matter slide so easily. Taking a deep breath, he suppressed his displeasure before turning to look at the young man standing at the center of the court. You are Dan Xiaotian? That's right, Elder Lu. Dan Xiaotian bowed deeply as he replied. Do you have any intention of joining the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? Elder Lu Yun asked. Dan Xiaotian was stunned for a moment as he discreetly glanced at his teacher. Upon receiving a nod from his teacher, he immediately bowed down and replied, It would be my honor to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Very well. Elder Lu Yun nodded. From this day onward, you are an outer disciple of our sect. Anyone who dares to oppress you will be an enemy of our sect as well, and you can be certain that he will face the full wrath of our sect. Ah! Dan Xiaotian was stunned. He thought that Elder Lu Yun would want to test his prowess before coming to a decision, but who could have thought that he was accepted so easily? Everything happened so fast that it almost felt like a scam. Were it not for his knowledge that the person standing before him was an elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, he would have definitely thought it was a farce. He had long heard that Elder Lu Yun, who was in charge of recruiting outer disciples, was a hot-blooded and straightforward person, and it seemed like those rumors weren't completely unfounded. Xiaotian, congratulations on becoming a disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. The first one to react was Shuegan. He congratulated Dan Xiaotian with a bright smile on his face, not showing any sign of awkwardness due to their earlier argument. Paying no heed to Shuegan's act, Dan Xiaotian took in a deep breath, and as if coming to a major decision, he kneeled down on the floor and cried out indignantly, Elder Lu, I beseech you to redress my grievance. Feel free to speak your mind. Elder Lu Yun replied. Our Dan clan used to be a major power in Shenjiang City. However, due to our great strength and influence, the City Lord Manor has always viewed us as a threat. Thus, the City Lord Manor set us, and that eventually caused the death of all of my family members. This is the evidence of their evil doings. Dan Xiaotain passed a jade token over to Elder Lu Yun. After the Dan clan had been destroyed, Elder Yi had devoted himself to uncovering the truth behind the fall of the Dan clan. However, the more pieces of evidence he gathered, the more suspicious City Lord Shuegan became. He dared not to reveal it in the past, fearing that the City Lord Manor would silence them, but with an elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion standing before him at this instant, he knew that there was no better opportunity for him to resolve this regret of his. This was the will of his teacher as well. Elder Lu Yun took the jade token and took a look at it. A moment later, his eyes narrowed in fury. Every evidence stored in the jade token indicated clearly that the deaths of all 97 members of the Dan clan had an inseverable relationship with City Lord Shuegan's doings. What do you have to say for yourself? Elder Lu Yun spat as he tossed the jade token over to Shuegan. Shuegan hurriedly picked up the jade token, and upon seeing the contents, his eyes widened in astonishment. He swiftly kneeled onto the floor and cried out, "Elder Lu, these are all lies. I am framed." Everyone in Shenjiang City can testify to the friendly relations between the City Lord Manor and the Dan clan. The very fact that there's a marriage agreement between Xiaotian and Xueqin is more than enough to show that. I have nothing to gain by making a move against the Dan clan. There must be a misunderstanding somewhere. It could be because Xiaotian is angered by my daughter's foolishness in listening to Xueqian's words and attempting to annul her engagement. Elder Lu Yun, I beg of you to investigate this matter carefully and return me justice. Rest assured that I'll give you a satisfactory answer. Elder Lu Yun harumphed before turning his attention away from the kneeling Shuegan. He looked at Dan Xiaotian and said, "While the evidence you have compiled is convincing, most of them can't be verified anymore due to the long interval since then. Furthermore, given that Shuegan is the city lord, if he were to intentionally hide his trails, I wouldn't be able to do anything about it either." "I understand," Dan Xiaotian replied with his head lowered. He knew that this would be the case. He knew it all along. It had been 10 years since tragedy struck the Dan clan, and Shenjiang City had changed a lot since then. Even if the evidence compiled was convincing, the passing of time would render most of them unverifiable, which meant that they couldn't be used to indict Shuegan anymore. Furthermore, Shuegan was a person who was willing to kill even for a mere annulment of engagement just to protect the reputation of the City Lord Manor. Considering how huge the massacre of the Dan clan was, he would have surely dealt with it promptly so that it would be impossible to link the incident to him anymore. It would undermine the authority of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion if I were to sentence a city lord to death without proper justification. However, there's an exception to the rule. At which, a glint flashed across Elder Lu Yun's eyes as he continued on, and that is, true strength. As long as you are able to display overwhelming talents that would make you an asset to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, you can be assured that the sect will side with you instead of a third-tier city lord. The only way you can do that is to become an inner disciple of our sect. If you are able to do so, you can be assured that the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion would resolve any problems you are facing so that you are able to focus on your cultivation. Inner disciple? Dan Xiaotian was stunned. The Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion was only accepting menial disciples from Shenjiang City. Even this role of a lackey was enough to puff Xueqin up with pride, leaving her feeling as if she had risen to the top of a peak. It was due to this that prompted her to annul her engagement with him in the first place. If he were to become an inner disciple, his standing would be higher than even Hu Jianghe and Shuegan. Naturally, the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion would feel more obligated to side with him instead of Shuegan. Just that. It was simply too difficult. Hu Jianghe was already an ancient sage 4-dan dimension Shatterer realm cultivator, but he still remained an outer disciple. Considering that Dan Xiaotian was only at Great Sage 3-dan consummation, would he stand a chance at all? Indeed. Every single inner disciple is an asset to the sect. Their standing is even higher than an outer elder like me. As long as you successfully become an inner disciple, even if you kill City Lord Shuegan without any justification, no one would question your judgment at all. Elder Lu Yun said. This. Not expecting Elder Lu Yun to suddenly say such words, Shuegan's eyebrows shot up in astonishment. It couldn't be that. The other party intended Dan Xiaotian to take the examination to become an inner disciple. But the examination for inner disciples was no joke. Dan Xiaotian might be talented, but it was nigh impossible for him to succeed. Elder Lu, may I ask, how does the examination for inner disciples work? I'm willing to give it a try. Dan Xiaotian pondered for a moment before asking. The examination for inner disciples focuses not on the cultivation of the individual but his potential. As long as one's potential is sufficiently high, even if one's cultivation is lacking, one would still be able to join the ranks. It's also possible for an outsider to become an inner disciple right away after joining the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. There's no need for one to become an outer disciple first before progressing upward. There are 2 criteria which one has to meet in order to become an inner disciple. Firstly, One has to reach Ancient Sage before 17. Secondly, one has to clear the inner disciple swordsmanship examination. At this point, Elder Lu Yun turned to Dan Xiaotian and asked, "How old are you at the moment?" "I am 16 right now, but..." Dan Xiaotian was just about to continue speaking when Elder Lu Yun suddenly interjected. "It's fine as long as you aren't 17 yet. Since you are already at Great Sage 3 Dan consummation, there's a good chance that you should be able to become an ancient sage before your 17th birthday. As for the swordsmanship examination for inner disciples, Hu Jianghe is the first senior for outer disciples, and his swordsmanship mastery already meets the requirement. As long as you are able to defeat him in the same cultivation realm, you can be deemed to have cleared the examination." "I have to defeat Senior Hu in the same cultivation realm?" Dan Xiaotian was a little nervous. He had only learned a night of swordsmanship with his teacher, whereas the other party was an expert from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, having studied swordsmanship for at least 20 years. It would be extremely difficult for him to defeat Senior Hu even if the latter were to suppress his cultivation down to the same level as him. Elder Lu Yun nodded, "Indeed. Do you wish to give it a try?" "Yes, I would like to give it a try." Dan Xiaotian hesitated for a moment before nodding firmly. This was the greatest opportunity in his life to exact vengeance for his parents and brothers. Once this opportunity slipped past his fingers, it would be nigh impossible for him to redress the grievances of the Dan clan anymore. After all, there was no way Shuegan would quietly sit here and wait to be killed. By the time he rose through the ranks, the other party would have long made his escape. Given how large the Forsaken Continent was, trying to find Shuegan again would be no different from searching for a needle amidst the boundless ocean. "Very well." Elder Lu Yun nodded. He turned to Hu Jianghe and said, "Suppress your cultivation down to Great Sage 3 Dan and fight him with everything you got. Don't hold back anything at all, understood?" "Yes, Elder Lu." Hu Jianghe nodded. He began walking toward Dan Xiaotian while suppressing his cultivation down to Great Sage 3 Dan. Getting into his position, he drew his sword before beckoning for Dan Xiaotian to come at him with a wave of his hand. "Come, teacher." This was the first time Dan Xiaotian was fighting with a real expert, so he couldn't help but feel a bit nervous. He turned to look at his teacher for support, but the latter was staring quietly into space, as if everything that was happening at the moment had nothing to do with it. From the looks of it, it was obvious that he didn't plan on interfering in this duel. "Forget it, I'll just have to give it my all." Dan Xiaotian gritted his teeth in resolution. His teacher had already given him a lot. He would have to take the last step himself in order to become an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, so he couldn't back down at this crucial moment. Who? In this short moment, Hu Jianghe was already charging toward him with incredible speed. It was almost as if a raging current was gushing toward Dan Xiaotian. However, after seeing Hu Jianghe's swordsmanship with his own eyes, what Dan Xiaotian felt wasn't trepidation but surprise. Hu Jianghe's sword art might appear to be complex on the surface, but this was all things that his teacher had spoken about before. With this knowledge, he found that he was able to swiftly deconstruct Hu Jianghe's move, stripping it of all of its elegance and complexity. It no longer held any secrets from him anymore, as if it was standing stark naked in his face. With this, everything else was a walk in the park. Staring right through the facade to peer into the enemy's intention, Dan Xiaotian was able to find 8 ways to overcome Hu Jianghe's swordsmanship in a moment's time. Thus, he drove his sword forward toward one of the core weaknesses in Hu Jianghe's swordsmanship. Taken aback, Hu Jianghe immediately leaped backward. To Dan Xiaotian, this was concrete evidence that his teacher's impartation was effective. So, he sent yet another pierce forward. Once again, Hu Jianghe was forced to retreat. Just like that, with one side advancing and the other side retreating, the cycle repeated for more than 20 moves. Their swords hadn't even clashed with one another once, but Hu Jianghe had already retreated 40 steps thus far. That swordsmanship. It's truly formidable. Huang Dao, Hu Bin, and the others were stunned by Dan Xiaotian's fighting prowess. They looked at one another as if they had seen a ghost. Chapter 1941 Dan Xiaotian's birthday. Hu Jianghe, Huang Dao, and Bamboo had fought with World's Edge back at the Ethereal Hall. World's Edge swordsmanship was like an enigma to them. It rendered them completely bewildered. They could tell that his swordsmanship was formidable, but they just weren't able to discern what was it about it that made it so formidable. To put it in other words, they only knew of the result but not the causes behind it. As such, they weren't able to accurately interpret his strength, much less evaluate it. But such was not the case for Dan Xiaotian. They could clearly see that every single strike he executed was aimed directly at Hu Jianghe's weakness, so Dan Xiaotian's strength was easy for them to comprehend. In less than 10 seconds, the 20 blows that were executed rendered Hu Jianghe unable to retaliate at all. Even true inner disciples wouldn't have such sharp swordsmanship. Even terrifying wasn't a sufficient adjective to describe this anymore. Is he World's Edge? Squarefaced asked. He had never crossed blows with World's Edge, so he didn't know the latter's moves and means. However, the others had fought with him before, so they might be able to see something that he couldn't. World's Edge defeated us as soon as the battle began. He didn't really execute any ordinary moves, so I can't really tell either. Unless he were to execute that move again, or else it would be difficult for us to verify it, Yun Feiyang said. It was not that their eye of discernment was lacking, but that sword toss was simply too powerful. Everything ended so quickly that they couldn't even gauge the true strength of the one executing the move. As such, they weren't able to evaluate his strength through his normal swordsmanship either. But given the current circumstances, it doesn't seem like Senior Hua would be able to force the other party into using that move either. Huang Dao remarked with a bitter smile. The crowd fell silent. The other party was already able to force Senior Hua back without using that technique. At this rate, even after Senior Hua lost, they would still be unable to confirm that if Dan Xiaotian was World's Edge. Actually, there's a way to test that. Just watch. Squarefaced turned his head over and shouted, Senior, use a river's glance. A river's glance was both Hu Jianghe's nickname in the Ethereal Hall, as well as the sword art he was the most skilled at. This skill was reminiscent of a river that flowed relentlessly until every boulder that stood in its path was crushed into bits. It was with this sword art that Hu Jianghe dominated over all of the outer disciples, solidifying his position as the first senior. All right. Hu Jianghe immediately understood his junior's intentions. With a furious roar, he infused his zhenqi furiously into his sword and drove it forth. In an instant, it was as if he had morphed into a vast river that threatened to sweep away everything that stood in his way. Seeing that Hu Jianghe had used his ultimate technique, Dan Xiaotian unhesitatingly flicked his sword forward. If he wished to defeat the other party, he would have to first crush the river before it reached him. Hu! Dan Xiaotian's sword pierced across the air. He had cultivated this move for the entire night, practicing it at least 1,000 times. His sword immediately vanished from the spot, and by the time it appeared once more, it was already right before Hu Jianghe's throat. Crap! Hu Jianghe widened his eyes in alarm. He had been so engrossed in trying to get World's Edge into using his ultimate technique that he forgot about the risk it posed. He immediately released the seal on his cultivation. In an instant, the might of an ancient sage 4-dan dimension Shatterer realm expert poured forth. It was only after regaining his true strength did he manage to block the sword outside. Nevertheless, cold sweat still poured down his back. If it had been an opponent of the same tier, that move would have already taken his life. It's him. Huang Dao and the others trembled in agitation upon seeing that move. There was no doubt about it anymore. Dan Xiaotian was definitely World's Edge. Shuigan's body also swayed weakly from side to side before falling to the ground. Ever since he returned from the Ethereal Hall yesterday night, he had been wondering who the expert known as World's Edge could be. He would have never thought that it was the son-in-law whom he despised and looked down on. Xueqin also nearly went insane at that moment. She was with Hu Jianghe yesterday night when the latter challenged World's Edge, so there was no way she wouldn't recognize that move. If Dan Xiaotian was World's Edge, didn't it mean that she had become his maid? Instead of being his fiancée, she had fallen to become his maid instead. At this moment, she really wanted to dig her eyes out. There was once such a brilliant jade before her, but she actually thought of it as nothing more than a concrete brick and cast it away. Watching the proceedings of the whole match, Elder Lu Yun nodded in excitement as he announced the results. Dan Xiaotian has won the duel. It was no wonder why the other party didn't agree to join the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion right away back then. It turned out that he was waiting for an opportunity to slap this city lord's face. He wanted to make the other party dearly regret the vile deeds he had committed in the future. Youths nowadays sure were hot-blooded. But again, considering that his family was torn apart, anyone in his place would have probably done the same as well. The fact that you were able to defeat Hu Jianghe means that you would be able to clear the inner disciple examination with ease. Given that you were able to reach Great Sage 3 Dan consummation by 16 without ample resources, it's almost a certainty that you'll be able to advance to Ancient Sage by 17. The more Elder Lu looked at the young man before him, the more satisfied he was with the latter. Thus, he declared loudly, "In my position as an elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, I announce that Dan Xiaotian has cleared the inner disciple trial. He has been accepted as one of the inner disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and he'll enjoy all of the privileges that inner disciples possess." "Thank you, Elder Lu." Dan Xiaotian heaved a sigh of relief before kneeling onto the ground to thank him. With this identity, even if he didn't have concrete evidence, he would still be able to kill Shui Gan and exact vengeance for his parent. Noticing the cold gaze Dan Xiaotian was directing toward him, Shui Gan's face warped in horror as he retreated fearfully. "What are you going to do? You still have a marriage agreement with Shui Qin. I am your father-in-law. Senior Hua, I beseech you to help me take him down. I want to exact vengeance for all 97 members of my clan." Dan Xiaotian gritted his teeth furiously. "While you were killing my family members, have you ever thought that you were my father-in-law? While Shui Chen was colluded with the bandits and nearly had me killed, have you ever thought that you were my father-in-law? To only recognize it right now, don't you think that it's far too late?" Hu Jianghe and the others moved in unison to take down Shui Gan. While Shui Gan was a formidable foe, Yun Feiyang, Huang Dao, and the others weren't weak either, not to mention that they possessed superb swordsmanship as disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. They were able to curb him with ease. "I don't kill the innocent." The Jade Token doesn't just contain the evidence of Shui Gan plotting against the Dan clan, it details all of the vile deeds he has committed over the past few years, Dan Xiaotian said. He took out the Jade Token once more and infused his zhenqi into it. In an instant, a huge chunk of text appeared in the air, showing all of the crimes which Shui Gan had committed over the years. He was the mastermind behind the autumn grassfield disaster. All along, I thought it was the deeds of the bandits. He was actually the culprit who plundered and murdered the Liu clan. That was a huge family of 40 members. The young daughter of the Chen clan was violated before her death. How could he have the cheek to claim that it was a deviant pervert who did it? For a city lord, he really has no decency at all. It's a pity that I viewed him as my idol all this while. I respected him, thinking that he was an upright and honorable individual. I would have never thought that he has committed so many atrocities in the shadows. The words revealed in the air invoked a huge commotion amongst the crowd. Shui Gan valued his reputation a lot, so he had done a lot of things in order to build a good name for himself, thus making him a highly respected figure in the city. Thus, when all of his deeds were revealed at this instant, everyone felt goosebumps rising on their arms. It was as if everything they had believed all along was just a lie. "What else do you have to say for yourself?" Dan Xiaotian glanced at Shui Gan and said. He slowly walked up to the subdued Shui Gan and placed his sword against the latter. As long as he pushed his sword a little further in, he would be able to easily impale Shui Gan's throat and exact vengeance for his family members. Shui Gan trembled in fear. Even though he had done a lot of cover-up work, he knew that it was impossible for him to destroy all evidence. As long as the crowd investigated those matters carefully, they would surely be able to find bits and pieces of evidence. If Dan Xiaotian was only an ordinary cultivator, he would still be able to take measures to silence Dan Xiaotian and quell the crowd, forcing them to stay silent. However, with Dan Xiaotian becoming an inner disciple, there was no way he could make a comeback anymore. It was the end. Enno. You can't kill my father. Just as Shuegan had closed his eyes, resigned to his fate, Xueqin suddenly rushed over and howled madly. Do you want to try that and see? Dan Xiaotian narrowed his eyes in scorn. You can't kill him. You aren't qualified to be an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, so you have no right to pass judgment on my father. Xueqin cried out desperately. What do you mean by his not qualified to be an inner disciple? Are you questioning my authority as an elder of the sect? Before Dan Xiaotian could speak, Elder Lu Yun had already interjected with a darkened face. He had supervised the duel right in front of such a huge crowd, and it was obvious that Hu Jianghe had used his full strength too. Xueqin had no right to question this judgment of his. No, that's not what I mean. Realizing that she had misspoken, Xueqin hurriedly raised her head and replied anxiously. Elder Lu, you mentioned earlier that there are 2 conditions Dan Xiaotian has to fulfill in order to become an inner disciple. The earlier trial was fair and impartial, so I dare not to question anything about that. However, I disagree with the first condition, which states that Dan Xiaotian has to become an ancient sage before his 17th birthday. Oh! Elder Lu Yun looked at Xueqin, indicating for her to go on. I am engaged with Dan Xiaotian, so I know his 8 birth characters. His birthday happens to be on today's Shen hour, which means that he would 17 by the time the Shen hour passes, Xueqin said with tightly clenched fists. There's only another hour till the Shen hour, but he's only at Great Sage 3 Dan consummation at the moment. How could he reach Ancient Sage by 17 at this rate? Given so, I believe that he's unqualified to become an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. This. Elder Lu Yun was stunned. He turned to look at Dan Xiaotian, only to see the latter with a reddened face. My birthday is indeed on today's Shen hour. Dan Xiaotian said awkwardly. He had wanted to say it earlier, but he was interrupted by Elder Lu. So, he thought of pushing ahead with it so that he could exact his vengeance. At most, he would just have to work doubly hard to make up for it in the future. He didn't think that Xueqin would remember his birthday. Seeing that Dan Xiaotian had admitted to it, Elder Lu Yun looked at the sun by the horizon and noted that it was already on the verge of setting. It was already afternoon, which meant that there were less than 2 hours left to Dan Xiaotian's 17th birthday, to advance from Great Sage 3 Dan consummation to Ancient Sage within such a short span of time. That was practically impossible. If Dan Xiaotian couldn't become an Ancient Sage by his 17th birthday, he wouldn't be able to meet the criteria required for him to become an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, which meant that he had no rights to sentence Shuegan either. This meant that his vengeance would have to fall through. It seems like it is heaven's will. Elder Lu Yun shook his head and sighed. He thought that he could finally recruit an inner disciple and make a huge contribution to the sect, but who could have thought that there would be such a hiccup? However, you need not worry. Even if you can't become an inner disciple now, there's still another chance. As long as you cultivate hard and reach Ancient Sage 4 Dan Dimension Shatter a Realm before 30, you'll still be able to become an inner disciple. There were different phases where one could be promoted as an inner disciple. After all, there were cultivators who displayed tremendous potential only later in their lives. If not for this, Hu Jianghe and the others wouldn't have stood a chance anymore either. However, if Dan Xiaotian were to go after this instead, he wouldn't be able to exact his vengeance anymore. Of course, as an elder of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, he could report this matter upward, but by the time an investigation team is sent down, quite some time would have already passed. Most likely, Shuegan would have already gotten away by then. Yes, I understand. Dan Xiaotian clenched his fists tightly as his eyes reddened in regret. In the end, he was still unable to exact vengeance for his family members. Was everything really going to end just like that? At this moment, a calm voice suddenly sounded. There's still another hour. Are you going to give up like this? Dan Xiaotian hurriedly raised his head, only to see that his teacher, who seemed to be dozing off all this while, had already stood up. There were still metallic chains tied around his arms, but his face had a smile that reflected composure and confidence. The 8 birth characters are the 8 characters that depict one's date and time of birth. Shen hour is 1500 to 1700. Chapter 1942. Dan Xiaotian pushes for a breakthrough to ancient sage tea. Overwhelmed by his agitation, Dan Xiaotian was just about to call out teacher when he saw the latter shaking his head, so he swiftly halted what he was saying. His teacher had instructed him earlier that he wished to keep a low profile and didn't want to stand out too much. So, while it was fine for him to greet his teacher normally in a private setting, he should address the latter as his friend before outsiders. Considering that there wasn't too huge of an age gap between the two of them, it was unlikely that others would suspect him. Paying respects to Elder Lu. "I am Zhong Xian, Dan Xiaotian's friend," Zhong Xian said as he walked over. It was only at this moment that Hu Jianghe got a good look at Zhong Xian's face too, and his expression turned a little unnatural. They had crossed one another back at Hongyang Market, but as the other party was tightly wrapped in bandages back then, he didn't recognize the other party instantly. However, putting the physique together with the voice, it was obvious that the person standing before him was the same person who had put him down at Hongyang Market. "You asked if Dan Xiaotian is going to give up. Do you think that it's possible for him to become an ancient sage within an hour?" Elder Lu Yun asked with a frown. "That's right," Zhong Xian replied with a nod. "I was injured previously, and he was the one who saved me, so I know of his true strength. In truth, he has already reached ancient sage a long time ago, but he overexerted himself while trying to treat me, resulting in his cultivation plummeting back to Great Sage 3 Dan. As long as he receives the appropriate treatment, I believe that it shouldn't be too hard for him to return back to his peak within an hour's time." Dan Xiaotian is actually an ancient sage. Perplexed, Elder Lu Yun turned to look at Dan Xiaotian once more. "Are you sure this is how an ancient sage should be like? Even if you are making up lies, you should come up with something more believable. Is it really all right for you to be spouting nonsense just like that?" Dan Xiaotian was also completely caught off guard by what Zhong Xian had said. It was only yesterday that he was still an insignificant Saint 6 Dan cultivator, and he thought that it was already an incredible feat how his cultivation could rise all the way up to Great Sage 3 Dan after the GU inside him was killed. Yet, his teacher was telling him that he was actually already an ancient sage. When did I become an ancient sage? Why do I not know of it? Give me an hour and don't allow anyone to interrupt me. I guarantee that I'll bring him back to his peak. Zhong Xian insisted despite the skeptical glances that others were shooting at him. He knew that it sounded ridiculous to most of them here, especially since it was obvious to almost everyone here that Dan Xiaotian was indeed a Great Sage 3 Dan cultivator. However, if he were to claim to raise Dan Xiaotian's cultivation by 2 realms within an hour instead, that would make an even more unbelievable story. And things would only get worse if he succeeded. Such an alarming deed would bring unwanted attention to him. Others might try to do him and Dan Xiaotian harm in hopes of figuring out his secret. Thus, after much consideration, he decided to go with the story that Dan Xiaotian was already an ancient sage. After all, the notion of a person recovering his strength wouldn't be as shocking as otherwise. Sigh, it sure is troublesome to maintain a low profile. But what can I do about it? I, Zhong Xian, am the type of person who likes to silently help others from the shadows without expecting anything in return. That's no trouble at all. While Elder Lu Yun felt that there wasn't much hope, he still decided to go along with the other party this once, considering how confident the other party appeared to be. He turned to Hu Jianghe and said, "Bring them to a quiet location. Meanwhile, I'll test the other examinees." "Yes, Elder Lu," Hu Jianghe replied before leading Zhong Xian and Dan Xiaotian away. He had been residing in the city lord residence the past few days, so he was extremely familiar with its layout. The residence he was allocated with was in a relatively quiet region, and rarely would there be anyone walking around there. It was the ideal place to bring Zhong Xian and Dan Xiaotian to. Entering Hu Jianghe's room, Zhong Xian emphasized once more that they mustn't be interrupted before sending Hu Jianghe away and shutting the doors. As soon as the doors were closed, Dan Xiaotian immediately kneeled down in front of his teacher and cried out, "But teacher, I am not an ancient sage. Are you saying that I'm lying earlier?" Zhong Xian refuted. This. Dan Xiaotian's face reddened. It was extremely disrespectful for a disciple to claim that his teacher was lying, though the issue became rather subjective when the teacher was truly lying. You are indeed not an ancient sage just yet, but that doesn't mean that you won't be one an hour from now, Zhongxian added with a confident smile. Does teacher believe that I am able to advance 2 cultivation realms within an hour? Dan Xiaotian was still a little hesitant. It was not that he didn't believe in his teacher's capabilities, but he didn't believe in himself. If it was that easy to advance one's cultivation, the Forsaken Continent would have been filled with ancient sages by now. Hush. From now onward, you are to heed my instructions strictly. Don't hesitate or go against whatever I tell you to do. Just do as you are told, got it? Zhongxian said. Yes, teacher, Dan Xiaotian replied with a nod. From the moment Zhongxian freed him from his affliction, he had already made up his mind to never go against his teacher's commands. Zhongxian took a look at Dan Xiaotian from head to toe before starting. You have been taking in spiritual energy over the past 10 years, but you didn't refine them into zhenqi. The unrefined spiritual energy has been tempering your body all this while, causing your body and meridians to be far stronger than the other cultivators. As long as we alter your meridian network a little, it shouldn't be too difficult to induce a breakthrough in your cultivation. Dan Xiaotian was confused. Alter my meridian network? Was it possible to change something innate like that? Wasn't it supposed to be fixed at birth? Wasn't one's meridians supposed to be very delicate? The so-called cultivation going berserk was the result of one accidentally channeling one's zhenqi into the wrong meridians for one reason or another, thus resulting in a violent backlash from one's body. If even directing one's zhenqi wrongly could induce such severe consequences, was it really all right to simply alter one's meridians like that? Indeed. It's a method which I have just thought of, but I haven't tested it out yet. Would you like to give it a try? If you succeed, it'll be a direct stairway to the top. You'll become an esteemed ancient sage of this world. But if you were to fail, you could very well become crippled and unable to cultivate, Zhongxian said grimly. Dan Xiaotian felt like tears were threatening to pour from his eyes. After all his teacher spoke of, his plan was still only in the realms of theory. It hadn't been tried out in practice at all. To actually try something that is untested on me. My teacher sure is courageous. But teacher, the thing is that I am not sure whether I'll be able to match your courage. While Dan Xiaotian did think that this teacher of his was unreliable from time to time, his teacher had been there for him when it truly counted. Thus, it didn't take long for him to nod hesitantly in agreement. Teacher, my life belongs to you. If not for you, I could have very well be dead by now. I am willing to entrust my life into your hands once more. Good. Let's get it over and done with then. Zhongxian nodded in satisfaction. And the truth was, Zhongxian really wasn't lying. He only thought of this method a moment ago. He was confident that he could get any cultivator to achieve a breakthrough to ancient sage with his guidance and ample resources within a few days, but to achieve a breakthrough of 2 realms within an hour. Not unless the other party practiced the complete Heaven's Path divine art like him, but of course, there was no one in the world who could practice the complete Heaven's Path divine art other than him. If Dan Xiaotian were to do so, he might just end up dying from being crushed by the heavens. So, Zhongxian could only search for other alternatives. Through his careful examination, he found that the meridians of those in the Azure were even more perfect than those of the otherworldly demonic tribe, but they hadn't reached the level of perfection yet. There were many flaws in the meridians of mankind, and that was why even at maturity, they still remained ordinary humans. Those in the 100 schools of philosophers had slightly fewer flaws, so they were able to reach Zhongsha realm at maturity. As for the indigenous population of the Azure, their meridians had the fewest mistakes, so they were able to reach Saint Nine Dan by adulthood. It was clear that if the perfection of one's meridian network came with a lot of advantages. It put one at a starting line ahead of the others, and it allowed one to cultivate faster than the others as well. Previously, Zheng Yang and the others also only managed to reach Dimension Shatterer realm swiftly due to the modification of their meridian network too. But of course, there were also other circumstances at play over here, so he couldn't say for sure that things would work out for Dan Xiaotian as well. It was not to say that Zhongxian wasn't confident in his theory, but it was just that there was a very, very small possibility that things might not go the way he wanted to, so he felt that he had to warn Dan Xiaotian in advance. With a flick of his wrist, a huge pot and a stack of firewood appeared in the room. It was only then that he realized he forgot to store water in his storage ring as well, so he quickly left the room to fetch a pail. Before long, the water was already boiling in the pot under the stack of burning firewood. "All right, come out and take a bath." He sent a telepathic message toward his dantian, and soon, the dongshu gourd appeared before him. It dived right into the pot of water and exhaled deeply in pleasure. While his heaven's pathshanchi was able to swiftly heal one's wounds, he wasn't certain that it would be enough to heal a wound as major as the total rupturing of one's meridians within just an hour. Furthermore, perhaps it was because the constitutions of those in the Azure and the Master-Teacher continent were different, or that those in the Azure were too adapted to the Mercury-like spiritual energy in the environment. Somehow, the Mercury-like spiritual energy in the air was less effective on them for healing purposes. Otherwise, all ancient sage cultivators in the Azure would be a pain to deal with if they could just keep healing up swiftly in the middle of the battle. Thus, he thought of using the dongshu gourd for that purpose. That pot of water was effective even on a Dimension Shatterer realm cultivator like him. Thus, it shouldn't have any problem with great sage cultivators like Dan Xiaotian. While Zhongxian was boiling the water, he turned to Dan Xiaotian and said solemnly, "You have to bear with the pain." "Yes." Dan Xiaotian nodded. Following Zhongxian's instructions, he sat on the floor unmovingly. Zhongxian walked up and placed his palm on the young man's abdomen. He infused his zhenqi into the young man's body and jolted it forcefully. Pu. Blood spewed frenziedly out of Dan Xiaotian's mouth. In an instant, all of the meridians in his body were ruptured by his teacher. The overwhelming pain caused a blackout in his head, and he nearly fainted just like that. Any other 16-year-old would have fainted by now, but after all of the challenges he had gone through since 6, his willpower was already as tough as steel. Gritting his teeth forcefully, he was able to barely retain a sliver of his consciousness. "Remember this, you mustn't pass out no matter what happens," Zhongxian emphasized once more. He began to drive his Heaven's Path zhenqi into Dan Xiaotian's body in order to connect his meridians together according to a more perfect network. The Heaven's Path zhenqi that was formed from the Mercury-like spiritual energy was much purer and denser from before. As it made its round through Dan Xiaotian's ruptured meridians, it swiftly mended them back together in a more perfect network mapping. "It does work. I was able to reconnect his meridians, but it seems like the rate at which my Heaven's Path zhenqi is healing his injuries is not able to catch up." Zhongxian heaved a sigh of relief when his job was finally done. The Heaven's Path zhenqi could heal internal and external injuries, but it was much less effective in healing those whose foundations had been shaken. The rupturing of one's meridians happened to be one such major injury that even the Heaven's Path zhenqi could only do much about. Without at least half a month of rest, Dan Xiaotian wouldn't be able to make a full recovery. Of course, this was already an amazing feat considering the severity of the condition. However, there was only an hour to go before Dan Xiaotian was 17, so time wasn't on their side. Thus, he brought the dongshu gourd's bathing water to Dan Xiaotian's lips and said, "Drink it." Gritting with the pain, Dan Xiaotian forced himself to swallow the water. Just like what Zhongxian said, his body was extremely tempered such that it was no different from that of an ancient sage anymore. As such, while drinking water was extremely painful for his current fragile state, it didn't pose a threat to him. Gugugu. As the bath water seeped into his body, his injuries swiftly healed up at a visible pace. In less than a minute's time, he was already healed up and back to normal. This. Dan Xiaotian widened his eyes in disbelief. He dared not believe that a gourd's bathing water would actually be so formidable. Seeing that Dan Xiaotian still had the leisure to be dazing off when they were already shot on time, Zhongxian smacked his head and berated, "Hurry up and absorb some spiritual energy and push for a breakthrough." "Why yes." Dan Xiaotian hurriedly focused his attention back to cultivation. Even though his meridians had ruptured earlier, it didn't affect his cultivation at all as his zhenqi was stored within his dantian. As such, he had already regained his great sage 3-dan consummation cultivation as soon as his meridians had healed up. Barely after he started cultivating, he found that the bottleneck that had limited him previously was already loose, allowing him to push for a breakthrough at any moment. Break. Without any hesitation, he drove his zhenqi and crashed down the bottleneck. The limitation on his cultivation was released, and he successfully broke into Great Sage 4 Dan's sempiternal realm. His breakthrough didn't stop there. Sempiternal realm primary stage, intermediate stage, advanced stage, pinnacle, perfection, consummation. In less than an hour's time, he was already a foot into ancient sage, seemingly on the verge of achieving a breakthrough at any moment. However, it was also at this moment that Zhong Xian felt the energy within Dan Xiaotian's body gradually dying down, reminiscent of a receding tide. It was just one last step, but Dan Xiaotian had already lost the momentum to push it through. It seems like I have been underestimating this matter. No matter what, a breakthrough to ancient sage is still a major leap. Even in the Azure, it's no easy feat to take this step forward. Zhong Xian thought as his heart tightened up. Chapter 1943 Xiaotian's Revenge. A breakthrough to ancient sage required eon of ancient sage, but this energy was everywhere in the Azure, so it wasn't a concern at all. However, a breakthrough to this realm was much more than just having the required amount of energy. Just like his breakthrough to Zhongsha realm back then, it required one to have sufficient accumulation. Dan Xiaotian's talents and mental resilience were decent, but he lacked accumulation. If they had another month's time, Dan Xiaotian would surely be able to make a breakthrough even without relying on any artifacts or special processes, but one's age waited for no one. Dan Xiaotian was on the verge of reaching 17 soon, and once the momentum fully died down, all hopes would be dashed. Swallow it. Zhong Xian took a deep breath, slitting his own wrist with his sword qi. Blood spurted out like a fountain, but he quickly gathered the blood together into a sphere before delivering it into Dan Xiaotian's mouth. The sudden loss of so much blood caused his face to pale a little. Dan Xiaotian opened his mouth and swallowed the fresh blood. In the next instant, he felt incredible energy pulsating within his body. As if someone had sparked up a blazing flame within him, the receding momentum immediately came back with greater vigor than before. As an ancient sage 4 Dan cultivator, every single droplet of Zhong Xian's blood essence contained an incredible amount of power. The sheer amount he had just given Dan Xiaotian was at least be comparable to that of a basic immortal pill. With such energy fueling him on, it took only a breath for Dan Xiaotian to return back to his peak, and his zhenqi swiftly built up at a frightening speed. Boom! The final bottleneck to ancient sage eventually succumbed under the heightening pressure, and a powerful shockwave gushed out from Dan Xiaotian. His aura surged up rapidly, not stopping at all just because of his breakthrough. It continued for quite a while before finally trailing to a halt. At this moment, Dan Xiaotian's cultivation had already reached ancient sage 1 Dan bloodline continuance realm consummation, a step away from reaching great philosopher realm. Dan Xiaotian quickly reinforced his cultivation a little before turning to the young man before him in agitation. Teacher. In order to allow him to achieve a breakthrough, his teacher had really sacrificed himself. He didn't know whether he could repay this massive favor to his teacher in his lifetime. I'm fine. The time is about to be up, so you should head out now. Given that your cultivation has reached ancient sage 1 Dan consummation, no one should dare to doubt you anymore. Cough cough. While Zhong Xian was relaying some instructions to his student, he couldn't help but cough a little. He had really overexerted himself this time around. Just the blood essence he had lost would take several months for him to recover. Teacher, please have a good rest. I'll head out now, Dan Xiaotian said before leaving the room. Watching as Dan Xiaotian's figure disappeared outside the doorway, Zhong Xian shook his head helplessly. He was just about to absorb the surrounding spiritual energy to recover his strength when he noticed that there was still a lot of gourd bathwater left in the huge pot. He hesitated for a moment before walking over and swallowing the rest down. Goo-goo-goo. He felt a buzz running through his body as his weakened body swiftly recovered. In the blink of an eye, his blood deficiency had been resolved, as if he had never been injured in the first place. This is... Zhong Xian widened his eyes in shock. The energy he had lost didn't return, but he was more than pleased with the current outcome. The Heaven's Path zhenqi could heal one's injuries, but it couldn't replenish the deficiencies in one's body. Yet, The gourd bathwater was able to do it so easily. Didn't this pretty much mean that he had an endless supply of senzu beans in his hands? That was really incredible. Just what in the world are you? Zhongxian asked the gourd, which was swimming in the remaining water left in the pot. This gourd is just an avatar I'm using at the moment. I'm afraid that I'll scare you out of your wits if I tell you the truth. My real body is actually a heaven-crushing, earth-shattering top-tier beast. You should kneel down right now and worship me like the divine being I am. The gourd shook its bottom gleefully. That didn't sound trustworthy at all to Zhongxian. Deciding to ignore the delusional Dongshu gourd, he stored the remaining water into bottles before keeping his stuff and walking out. As soon as he stepped out of the room, his face immediately turned yellowish, and his body wobbled from side to side with each step that he took, as if he would collapse to the ground at any moment. Many had already expressed their skepticism when he claimed that Dan Xiaotian was already an ancient sage whose cultivation plummeted as a result of overexertion. Of course, they might be more inclined to believe it now given that the latter was already at ancient sage 1 Dan consummation, but there would still be those who held their reservations. If the both of them were to walk out completely fine, there were bound to be those who would try to probe deeper into this matter in order to find out the truth. Thus, he decided to feign injury. This way, he would send out the message that even if Dan Xiaotian had really forcefully raised his cultivation to ancient sage within the span of an hour, one would have to pay an extremely heavy price for that. That should at least deter most people. Do you think that Dan Xiaotian will succeed? The trial for the menial disciple selections concluded rather swiftly, leaving Elder Lu Yun and the others with some time on their hand. Huang Dao looked at the direction where Zhongxian and Dan Xiaotian had disappeared toward and asked. It's impossible to raise one's cultivation from Great Sage 3 Dan to Ancient Sage in just an hour's time. Yun Feiyang shook his head, pessimistic about the odds. Indeed. Such a thing is unheard of even in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. In any case, I don't think Dan Xiaotian stands a chance at all. Square-faced nodded in agreement. Regarding this matter, even Elder Lu Yun harbored some reservations too. There's no need to wait anymore. Unless the gods were to make a move personally, it's impossible for him to achieve a breakthrough to Ancient Sage within an hour. Knowing that it was impossible Dan Xiaotian to become an inner disciple anymore, Shuegan also lost his fear and sneered coldly. But before he could finish his words, footsteps echoed outside as a young man approached the court. How is it? Knowing that it was Dan Xiaotian, Elder Lu Yun hurriedly turned his gaze over and asked. It was not easy, but I managed to do it. Dan Xiaotian replied with a smile as he began circulating his zhenqi. The energy within his body immediately burst out, and his aura pierced right into the heavens. Boom! The sudden outburst of zhenqi caused the entire court to shudder non-stop, producing a frightening creaking noise. The 1,000 spectators that were gathered here felt great pressure crushing down on them. It was as if a compelling force was trying to force them to their knees. Ancient Sage 1 Dan, consummation? Shuegan's face froze. All of the words he was intended to say were clogged at the back of his throat, and he looked stupefied. Putong. Not too far away, Xueqin's body slumped to the ground as her lips quivered fearfully. She couldn't find a word to say at all. The fiancé whom she had looked down on for so long, over the span of a single day, in the most forceful method possible, crushed every shred of her dignity without any mercy. She had never felt that a day could be that long before. Had she known that this would happen, she would have never dared to lay her hands on Dan Xiaotian. If she hadn't been so foolish as to attempt to break her engagement the previous day, things wouldn't have ended up like this either. Xiaotian, we are in-laws. Surely you wouldn't. Even at this point, Shuegan was still determined to make a final struggle. In-laws? Dan Xiaotian interjected with a cold sneer. My apologies. This is my divorce letter. Xueqin has shown herself to be a depraved individual lacking any shred of decency, and for that reason, I am unwilling to have her as my wife. With a flick of his finger, he threw a piece of paper into the air, and it floated quietly to the ground. The crowd could clearly see the 2 words divorce letter written at the top of the paper. This was yet another heavy blow on Xueqin's pride. Instead of annulling the engagement, she ended up being divorced instead. There was probably no greater fool in the world than her. She was so desperate to protect her pride that it ended up making her the greatest laughingstock of Shenjiang City. What an irony. Pu. Unable to take it any longer, Xueqin spurted a mouthful of blood. Elder Lu, I can be considered to be an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion now, right? Dan Xiaotian looked at Elder Lu Yun and asked. Elder Lu Yun responded with a nod of his head. That's good. I'd like to trouble Junior Hua to strip Shuegan of his cultivation and hang him outside the city lord residence. I'll announce his crimes and have him publicly executed for his vile deeds. Dan Xiaotian instructed. Yes. Hu Jianghe replied with a nod. Now that Dan Xiaotian had been confirmed as an inner disciple, it was only natural that he had become the other party's junior. The difference in seniority also meant that he had to heed the other party's instructions too. Father, mother, and my brothers. I have finally avenged all of you. It didn't take long before Shuegan's head was publicly decapitated. Kneeling down on the floor, all of the emotions that Dan Xiaotian had bottled up within him finally came pouring out all at once. For 10 whole years, he had sealed all these feelings deep in his heart, but right now, he couldn't contain them any longer. He cried loudly like a little child, but gradually, the heaviness that had weighed him down all this while was disappearing. He was finally free. By the time he finished his venting his emotions, he saw his teacher standing a distance away with a pale face. Astonished, he hurriedly got up and rushed over. If not for this young man, he would have never been able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. He would just have been another pitiful soul killed by the City Lord Manor. It could be said that everything he had right now was given to him by the other party. He really wanted to shout out to the world and tell everyone that this person was his teacher, and all of his accomplishments were due to his teacher's guidance. But knowing that his teacher's desire to keep a low profile, he could only hold himself back. But while he was swiftly making his way over to the teacher whom he deeply respected, he saw the shaking young man reaching his palm out to Yun Feiyang and the others and saying, Dan Xiaotian is now an inner disciple of your sect. As outer disciples, shouldn't each of you offer a couple of basic immortal pills to him as congratulation? This is not a gift but an investment for the future. As long as he gets a footing in the sect, it'll do you much good in the future too. Dan Xiaotian's passionate run screeched to a halt. Is my teacher trying to collect protection fees from Yun Feiyang and the others? Is this really my low-profile, stern, and righteous teacher? Why does he seem so superficial to me right now? Yun Feiyang and the others were dumbstruck too. When they saw Dan Xiaotian's cultivation leaping 2 realms in an hour, they thought that it was the credit of the young man before them. So, they approached him in hopes of asking about the details, but who could have thought that the other party would cheerily ask them for pills instead? That crushed the grand image they had formed of this young man in their minds. It seemed like Dan Xiaotian was really an ancient sage right from the start, and this young man had only used some kind of secret art in order to help him regain his strength. Otherwise, how could such a formidable expert possibly be so shameless as to ask for protection fee right in front of so many people? There was just no way the utterly shameless man before them could be capable of such a formidable feat. Impossible. Cough cough. Elder Lu Yun also couldn't bear watching the sight any longer. He coughed lightly to dispel the awkwardness in the air before saying, Xiaotian, inner disciples are allowed to bring their servants with them to the sect. I believe there's no reason binding you to Shenjiang City anymore, so why don't we head over to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion now? Yes, Elder Lu. Dan Xiaotian replied. Having exacted his vengeance, there was nothing left for him to reminisce about Shenjiang City anymore. It was time for him to head to the larger world out there and experience new things. I wish to bring Elder Yi and Brother Zhong along, Dan Xiaotian informed Elder Lu. There was no doubt that he had to bring his teacher along with him. Elder Yi had also served him for many years, so he couldn't just abandon the other party either. To him, these two were more than enough. He didn't need any menial disciple or the sort to serve him. Besides, his teacher valued his privacy. It would be jarring on him if he were to bring more people with him. All right. You should head back and make some preparations. We'll set off from here 2 hours from now, Elder Lu Yun said. Dan Xiaotian nodded before finally walking over to his teacher. He couldn't help but notice that there was a slight tinge of disappointment on his teacher's seemingly nonchalant face. Clearly, he didn't receive the protection fees he had demanded earlier. "Teacher, let's return home for a while. I would like to pack some stuff and take one last look around the residence before leaving for the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion," Dan Xiaotian said. By now, they were already far away from Elder Lu Yun and the others, so there was no need to conceal their identity anymore. Zhong Xian nodded in response. In truth, the reason why he demanded protection fees was so as to divert attention away from him, and it seemed like it was working out fine. He really wasn't disappointed that he didn't receive anything at all. "I wonder how long I'll be able to conceal myself in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion for. Being too talented can be exasperating at times." Zhong Xian rubbed his forehead as he thought. If he had a choice, he wouldn't want to be so conspicuous either. But people were simply too easily dazzled whenever he made a move. It was not something that he could help. Putong. While Zhong Xian was deep in thoughts, the bandit, Cao Chengli, suddenly rushed over and kneeled onto the ground in front of him. His eyes were filled with sincerity and expectations. "Young master, please accept me as well. It would be my greatest honor to serve as your humble servant. Look. I am simply too outstanding that even bandits can't help but fall for my charms." Zhong Xian sighed deeply. Reference to Dragon Ball Z, it's a medicine that heals one up quickly. Chapter 1944. Arriving at the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, others might not know Zhong Xian's identity, but Cao Chengli had seen Dan Xiaotian addressing him as teacher with his own eyes. To be able to make a trashy Saint 6 Dan who could not even cultivate advance to ancient Sage 1 Dan consummation within a single day. Even though he had seen it happen with his own eyes, he still found it hard to believe. If he were to follow such a person, there was no doubt that he would be able to soar through the ranks. Furthermore, nearly all of his subordinates had been killed, and he was currently in the middle of the city himself. At this rate, it was likely that he would be lynched and killed by the furious mobs before he could even leave the city. After all, he had done quite a number of evil deeds over the years since he dominated the mountain range. There were plenty of people who would be more than happy to skin him alive. "You want to become my subordinate?" Zhong Xian frowned. "Do you think that I'll accept you as my subordinate? I suggest that you drop that ludicrous idea." The only reason he had spared Cao Chengli for so long was so that the latter could reveal Xue Chen's ploy. Now that everything was over, why should he bother wasting his energy to save a bandit who had committed so much evil in his life? "Do I look like some kind of holy saint to you? Master, I'll kneel here till you are finally willing to accept me," Cao Chengli insisted resolutely. "Kneel here till the day you die then." Zhong Xian waved his hand coldly. "Master." Cao Chengli did not think that the other party would reject him so flatly. With a sorrowful look on his face, he cried out, "It's not as if I wanted to become a bandit. I had no choice but to turn to this. I used to be a kind businessman, but there was one time I drank myself silly, and my wife ended up not allowing me to return to the house. So, I had to sleep in the carriage outside, but it was so freezing that I was forced to get a room at the nearby brothel instead. In the end, due to my intoxication, I ended up calling for 7 women at once, and it was a night that I would never forget. But after that, enough. Stop trying to win us over with your sob story. My teacher is an upright person who abhors Evilders like you. Accepting you as his subordinate would only sully his reputation. Scram. Otherwise, I'll sever your head right now," Dan Xiaotian yelled furiously. "Just who does Cao Chengli take my teacher to be? My teacher might be greedy, but he is still a dragon in the sky, a figure in the clouds who towers over the world. My teacher's reputation would only be tarnished if he accepted a bandit like you as his subordinate. Even if my teacher agrees to it, I'll never agree. Besides, are you sure that you are telling a sob story? Why does it seem like you are boasting instead?" Seeing that Dan Xiaotian was ready to make a move on him at any moment, Cao Chengli's face paled. However, he knew that he would not be able to live if he did not become Zhong Xian's subordinate, so he gritted his teeth and presented his trump card. "Master, The others will surely tear me apart if you don't accept me as my subordinate. Since I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather give everything that I have to you instead. Over the years, I have chosen to plunder only from the wealthier businessmen, but I have still managed to save quite a bit of wealth myself. There are 10 basic immortal pills in this storage ring, and they are my entire fortune. I am willing to present all of them to you, Master. Don't think that you can bribe my teacher with this. He won't fall for such shallow tricks. Dan Xiaotian spat coldly. But just as he was about to push Cao Chengli away, his pale-faced teacher suddenly shook free from his support and stood upright. Like some kind of magic trick, the storage ring suddenly vanished from Cao Chengli's hand and appeared in his teacher's. Zhong Xian hurriedly wiped away the soul imprint on the storage ring and took a look at the contents within. A moment later, he nodded in satisfaction and said, "Fine, I'll accept you as my subordinate. Come with me." With each single basic immortal pill costing 100,000 ethereal coins, 10 of them would be worth 1 million ethereal coins. Furthermore, they were all stored in a storage ring that was priced at a hefty sum of 500,000 ethereal coins at the very least. Who would have thought that this bandit actually had such wealth with him? With so much money, he could make an exception just this once and take in Cao Chengli as his subordinate. Teacher. Dan Xiaotian was stunned. Is this man really my teacher? If so, why do I find him so embarrassing at this very moment? A person who could make him advance 2 cultivation realms within an hour and possessed exceptional skills in both medicine and swordsmanship. He should have been a transcendental being who cared not for material possessions at all. How could he be taken in by just a couple of pills? Where is his bottom line? Where is his dignity as an expert? Dan Xiaotian did not have too many things that he wanted to take with him, so after taking one last look at the place in which he had grown up, he returned to the City Lord Manor with Elder Yi, Zhong Xian, and Cao Chengli. Initially, the horse and carriage had insisted on coming along as well. They threatened to kill themselves if they were left behind. But seeing that their threats were simply shrugged off as if they were nothing at all, they eventually gave up and headed into the wilderness to live together. Considering that Zhong Xian and the others were going to take an aerial beast to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, it would indeed be inconvenient for them to take a horse and a carriage with them. As for Xue Qin, it went without saying that her slot as a menial disciple had been cancelled after everything was exposed. It was fortunate that she had not done too many bad things in the past, so no punishment had come upon her. However, with her father's death, she would lose the protection of the City Lord Manor. Her life probably would not be too easy from now on. Seeing this, Dan Xiaotian also lost his interest in settling the score with Xue Qin. He was more interested in the life ahead of him instead of pursuing whatever that had happened in the past. Let's go. With all preparations ready, the massive aerial beast flapped its wings and carried Zhong Xian and the others away from Xianjiang City. Before long, they were already well on their way to the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. It'll take roughly 10 days of flight to reach our sect. Elder Lu Yun told them. The aerial beast that they were riding on was at ancient sage 4-dan dimension Shatterer realm. With its strength, it could easily cover several 100,000 li despite the heavier space in the azure. Yet, for them to still require 10 days before reaching their destination. It seemed like the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion was really far away. From the looks of it, it was likely that the Forsaken Continent was even larger in scale compared to the Master Teacher Continent. Due to Dan Xiaotian's esteemed position as an inner disciple, he was allocated a private room on the flight. Naturally, he shared it with Zhong Xian and the others. During the flight, Zhong Xian swallowed 2 of the basic immortal pills that he had received from Cao Chengli and managed to return to his full strength. He also made sure to reinforce his cultivation again and again with the Mercury-like spiritual energy, to the point that he was ready to make a breakthrough at any moment. However, as he still did not have any suitable cultivation techniques on hand, he could only hold himself back for the time being. After several days of careful inspection, while he had already sensed it previously, he was finally able to confirm that the time flow in the azure was indeed different from that on the Master Teacher Continent. To put it in a ratio, it was 1:10. In other words, a day in the azure would be equivalent to the passing of 10 days in the Master Teacher Continent. So, Tens of thousands of years on the master-teacher continent equated to just several thousand years in the azure. That corresponded to the time when the ethereal hall was first founded too. As a result of the pressures of time and space in the azure, the lifespan of the cultivators there was significantly reduced as well. Saint cultivators could live for up to 1,000 years on the master-teacher continent, but 100 years was the limit for them here. Similarly, ancient sage cultivators only had a lifespan of slightly more than 100 years here. As for pseudo-immortals like Elder Lu Yun, his lifespan was also only 300 years. That might be the reason that so many of them desired to descend to the master-teacher continent despite the severe damage that they would sustain as a result. Over the next few days, other than focusing on his own cultivation, Zhongxian also spent some time offering pointers to Dan Xiaotian and Cao Chengli. As for Elder Yi, due to his advanced age and huge deficiencies that he had suffered over the years, he needed some time to recuperate. Thus, it was not suitable for him to cultivate for the time being. Just like that, 10 days passed in a flash. As the morning sun rose from the horizon, the crowd saw a massive mountain gate towering in front of them. It was almost 10,000 meters tall and several thousand meters wide. Due to its hulking size, the top of the gate was concealed amid the clouds. This reminded Zhongxian of the southern gate of heaven. At the very center of the gate was a massive sword made out of concrete piercing into the earth. Even before coming close, they could already feel an incredible sword intent coming from it. It seemed to wield the strength to shatter even space itself, and the pressure it exerted could easily render any cultivator immobile. How formidable! Zhongxian was astonished. As expected of one of the 6 sects of the Azure, there was just no way this massive gate and sword could have been created on the master-teacher continent. A formidable sword intent that was even more powerful than any of the sword quintessence he had practiced previously pulsated from the massive sword. If he were to meet an expert who practiced the swordsmanship carrying this sword intent, even he would be defeated easily. It seemed like the 6 sects were indeed terrifying powers. Out of curiosity, Zhongxian activated his Eye of Insight and took a closer look at the massive sword. He could vaguely see an illusory sword hidden in the depths of the massive concrete sword. That was probably the physical manifestation of the tremendous amount of sword intent gathered within the massive concrete sword. To his surprise, the conceptualization behind the sword intent was rather similar to the Heaven's Path sword art, but it was clearly something of an even higher level. It felt profound and transcendental even by Zhongxian's standards. Just by looking and perceiving it, Zhongxian was able to gain a deeper understanding of the crux of swordsmanship. While it was impossible for him to truly understand the sword intent with just a glance, due to the similar conceptualization, he was confident that, as long as he had sufficient time, he would be able to infuse this sword intent into his Heaven's Path sword art, thus raising his swordsmanship to another level. The Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion is just right ahead. This sword was left behind by our founder. It harnesses his understanding of swordsmanship and the sword intent he comprehended. Even to this day, his accomplishments continue 2 or generations of sword practitioners, Elder Lu Yun said as he looked at the massive gate and sword with admiration in his eyes. Dan Xiaotian's body also stiffened a little as his eyes reddened. Even in the days when he was practicing his swordsmanship alone, from time to time, he would dream of visiting the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion one day to practice the best swordsmanship in the world. This was a dream come true for him. There was still some time before the aerial beast flew through the gate, so Elder Lu Yun turned to Dan Xiaotian, Zhongxian, and the others and said, "Before we enter the sect, I would first like to inform you of the rules of our sect. The disciples of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion can mainly be divided into 4 tiers, namely menial disciples, outer disciples, inner disciples, and core disciples. While inner disciples are already highly respected within the sect, the standing of the core disciples exceeds that." Core disciples? Dan Xiaotian's eyes glowed with anticipation. That's right. To be honest, there isn't much you have to do as an inner disciple of the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. You can freely allocate your time to practicing your swordsmanship or cultivating. If you require any resources to study, you can browse through the books in the Inner Disciples Library. Otherwise, You can also approach any of your seniors or elders and request their help. Of course, most of the resources don't come free. You'll have to pay with Sword Pavilion coins, Elder Lu Yun said. Sword Pavilion coins? Zhong Xian repeated quietly with a hint of exasperation in his voice. He had not expected there to be another currency used within the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and he had a feeling that he would have to spend quite a bit of effort to earn it in the near future. It really felt like he would never be free from monetary problems at this rate. The Sword Pavilion coin is a virtual currency used only within the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. It can be used to buy whatever you need, be it pills, weapons, cultivation techniques, or even lessons from elders. However, earning them can be quite troublesome. You have to either participate in the dueling ring, complete missions, answer the questions of others, or guide others on their cultivation. In any case, the most important thing you have to know is that everything within the sect requires Sword Pavilion coins. Without them, you'll face obstacles in whatever you do. On the other hand, if you are able to earn sufficient Sword Pavilion coins, you'll be able to claim an endless supply of cultivation resources. Naturally, you'll also be able to advance your cultivation faster than anyone, Elder Lu Yun explained. Dan Xiaotian was a little surprised as well. Things were a little different from what he had envisioned it out to be. He had imagined the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion to be a transcendental sect where material needs would be of secondary concern. Everyone would be fully immersed in exploring the profoundness of cultivation and swordsmanship. Contrary to his expectations, there seemed to be quite a capitalistic economy in there. Wait a moment, Elder Lu. You mentioned earlier that Sword Pavilion coins is a virtual currency. Does that mean that the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion has its own ethereal hall? Zhong Xian asked. You can think of it that way. We have our own private ethereal hall that the disciples can access. Similar to the other ethereal halls out there, it's a place where our disciples spar and trade with one another. The only difference would be that our ethereal hall is controlled internally by our own people, and it has its own currency and system. It's independent of the other ethereal halls out there, Elder Lu Yun replied. Zhong Xian nodded in realization. To use an analogy from his previous world, the ethereal hall within the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion was like a local area network in a PC cafe. Only those on devices belonging to the PC cafe could access this isolated network. Oh right, the standard level of cultivation in our own ethereal hall is different, too. Our ethereal hall can only be accessed by inner disciples and above, so the standard level of cultivation inside the ethereal hall is not Saint Wandan but Ancient Sage Wandan, Elder Lu Yun said. For those who entered the ethereal hall in Starlight City, no matter how powerful they were outside, their cultivation realm would be reduced to Saint Wandan. However, it was different here. No matter how powerful or weak a person was, their cultivation would be set at Ancient Sage Wandan within the ethereal hall. This made sense since a lot of the more formidable swordsmanship could not be executed if one's strength was capped at only Saint Wandan. That would also render the dueling ring meaningless. Other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. You are able to hide your identity and change your appearance, too, such that others will be unable to tell who you are and vice versa. However, this also means that the person whom you are talking to could be an elder or even the sect leader himself. Thus, you must make sure not to act audaciously within the ethereal hall. While our elders and sect leader aren't vindictive people, you can still get into a fair bit of trouble if you overstep your bound. Elder Lu Yun warned gravely. Elder? Sect leader? Hearing that explanation, not only was Zhong Xian not nervous in the least, his eyes even lit up in excitement. He could not help but wonder, if I beat up an elder or the sect leader, will it be more exhilarating than beating up ordinary cultivators? It's said that there are 4 gateways into the heavens, and the southern gate of heaven is the gateway between the mortal world and the heavens. It has appeared in many classic Chinese works like Journey to the West, 8 Immortals, Legend of the White Snake, and so on. Chapter 1945 Ten Li Sword God against those of the same cultivation realm, Zhong Xian could be said to be pretty much invincible. Even if the opponent he was facing was an elder or the sect leader, he was confident that he would not lose with his abilities. Since that was the case, he should be able to bully them a little. Those people were likely to have quite a few good items on them, and they were bound to have important information as well. As long as he could defeat them, he should be able to get some stuff out of them. He might even be able to gather some news regarding the Spirit God Palace through this. It seemed like his very first target after entering the Ascendant Cloudsword Pavilion would be to acquire a suitable ethereal token and enter their ethereal hall. Then, he would find the highest-ranking person possible and coerce the other party into giving him what he needed. With such thoughts in mind, Zhong Xian struck his leg in excitement before standing up. That's truly a wonderful idea. I'll do just that. Heh! What are you going to do? Elder Lu Yun turned to look at Zhong Xian with doubt in his eyes. I just warned you that you might meet the elders or the sect leader in the ethereal hall. What are you getting all so excited about? Are you possibly mentally retarded? Elder Lu was still wondering if he should accept Zhong Xian into the sect as well, but over the past few days, he had found that the latter had a tendency to suddenly go on an insanity streak. Each time Zhong Xian acted in such a manner, his conviction to do so would waver a little, and by now, it had already dissipated entirely. It's nothing at all. My thoughts just wandered a bit, Zhong Xian replied with a smile. On the other hand, Dan Xiaotian clasped his face in embarrassment. Passing through the towering gates, the aerial beast eventually landed on a tall mountain. Leaping down from the back of the beast, Elder Lu Yun swiftly arranged a residence for Dan Xiaotian. The rest of you should rest here for the time being. Dan Xiaotian, come with me. You have to take the examination first. Elder Lu Yun said as he gestured for Zhong Xian, Cao Chengli, and Elder Yi to stay in the residence for the time being. Examination? The examination I conducted for you earlier only shows that you have the qualifications to become an inner disciple. In order to formalize the process, you have to head to the Sword God Hall to display your swordsmanship. Elder Lu Yun said. The Sword God Hall? Yes, it's the place where disciples are tested. Be it menial disciples intending to become outer disciples or inner disciples hoping to become core disciples, they have to showcase their swordsmanship at the Sword God Hall. It's similar to my intentions when I got you to spar with Hu Jianghe, but the evaluation at the Sword God Hall will be far more accurate. It'll reflect your current strength more clearly, Elder Lu explained with a smile. In a battle, a sword practitioner's swordsmanship is influenced by their physical state, mental resilience, reflexes, and so on. However, these factors are disregarded in the Sword God Hall. As long as your comprehension of the sword has reached a satisfactory level, the results will reflect so. Dan Xiaotian widened his eyes in realization. Let's go. Elder Lu Yun said as he beckoned Dan Xiaotian to follow him. Zhong Xian walked over and said, Elder Lu Yun, I'm also interested in the Sword God Hall. Would it be inappropriate if I were to follow you? He had never heard of something that could test one's comprehension of swordsmanship before, and he was genuinely curious about how the system worked. This. Elder Lu Yun hesitated for a moment before nodding. I guess it should be fine. Under normal circumstances, no outsiders would be allowed in the Sword God Hall. However, considering how even menial disciples were able to enter the premises to take the examination, it should be fine for Zhong Xian to tag along and have a look in his capacity as Dan Xiaotian's friend. Thus, they got onto the back of the aerial beast once more and flew toward another mountain peak. What was particularly striking about this mountain peak was that there was a sword-like building lodged into the ground on it, reminiscent of a tower. This is the Sword God Hall. Every day, numerous menial disciples, outer disciples, and inner disciples come over to have their swordsmanship evaluated, Elder Lu Yun said as they walked into the tower. As soon as they entered, they saw quite a few people standing around the lobby with swords on their backs. Sword intent could be felt in the aura they emanated. Shockingly, most of their cultivation was actually not beneath that of Zhong Xian's. As expected of one of the 6 sects of the Azure, it's indeed filled with plenty of expert. Zhong Xian thought. He had thought that his ancient sage 4-dan cultivation was not too bad, but it turned out that it could only be considered average at best. Furthermore, those who were present were still not the most powerful of all. It was hard to imagine how powerful the core disciples, elders, and sect leader were. Knowing that the two of them did not know anything about the Sword God Hall, Elder Lu Yun explained, "There are many rooms in the Sword God Hall, and every single one of them has a Sword God pedestal. As long you pay an ample number of Sword Pavilion coins, you'll be able to enter the room and test your swordsmanship. Of course, the first test you take is free. It's the subsequent ones that require money." Dan Xiaotian heaved a sigh of relief. He had just arrived at the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion, and he still had no idea what the Sword Pavilion coins looked like. There was no way that he could have forked out the money required. "Wait here for a moment, I'll open a room. Dan Xiaotian, you can enter first." "Zhong Xian, if you wish to give it a try, you can enter after he's done. The Sword God pedestal can only assess one cultivator at a time, or else it will interfere with scanning the sword intent," Elder Lu Yun said before heading to the front receptionist. Before long, they were already standing before an ornate door. Elder Lu Yun turned to Dan Xiaotian and said, "After you enter the room, hold the sword tightly and unleash your sword intent and conceptualization of your swordsmanship. If the manifestation of your sword intent surpasses 1 meter, you will be eligible to become a menial disciple. 10 meters, and you'll be able to become an outer disciple. 30 meters, and you are qualified to join the ranks of the inner disciple. Right now, 30 meters is the goal you should set for yourself." 30 meters. Dan Xiaotian nodded slowly. He did not have much of a gauge on difficult it would be to reach 30 meters. Noticing the contemplative look on Dan Xiaotian's face, Elder Lu Yun explained with a smile, "Don't worry, the manifestation of sword intent depends on your comprehension of swordsmanship, not your sword chi. With your cultivation, it's impossible to produce 30-meter-long sword chi." I see." Dan Xiaotian scratched his head awkwardly. With his current swordsmanship prowess, he could only exert sword chi of around 2 to 3 meters in length. 30 meters was far beyond his current capabilities. So, the manifestation of sword intent that Elder Lu Yun was talking about was not referring to sword chi. "Jia." Dan Xiaotian pushed the door open and walked in. Meanwhile, Zhong Xian turned to Elder Lu Yun and curiously asked, "May I ask what the best record for an inner disciple's manifestation of sword intent is? If 30 meters was the minimum requirement to clear the selection, what was the record of the best sword practitioners in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? Under normal circumstances, one would be qualified to become a core disciple if the manifestation of his sword intent reached 100 meters. That being said, there are quite a few inner disciples who have surpassed that record, and some of the best inner disciples have even reached 300 meters and beyond," Elder Lu Yun said. 300 meters? Zhong Xian was astonished. He had no idea how this manifestation of sword intent was calculated, but if even outer disciples had trouble reaching 30 meters, those who could achieve a record 10 times that had to be truly terrifying existences. Of course, that's only among the inner disciples. There are plenty of formidable experts among the core disciples, and some of them have even exceeded 500 meters. Anyone who exceeds that record is bestowed the title of Sword God. That's also where the titles 1 Li Sword God and 2 Li Sword God come from. It's said that in the entire history of the sect, the most talented person once materialized his sword intent across a distance of 10 li, and thus, others respectfully addressed him as 10 Li Sword God. Elder Lu Yun explained with admiration gleaming in his eyes. 10 Li Sword God. Zhong Xian was astonished. While other sword practitioners were frustrating over how short theirs were, that expert actually reached over 10 li. That was truly inconceivable. "May I know how far your sword intent is able to materialize, Elder Lu Yun?" Zhong Xian asked out of curiosity. "Me?" Elder Lu Yun was slightly surprised by the question. A bitter look appeared on his face as he shook his head. "I don't have much talent for swordsmanship, so I didn't even make it as an inner disciple back when I was in my younger years. It was through my relentless hard work that I eventually reached my current level of cultivation and got myself the position of an external elder. Even though I have practiced the way of the sword for many years, I am still unable to reach the 100 meters mark. Currently, I'm only at 97 meters. 97 meters? That's already a formidable feat, Zhongxian remarked as he turned his gaze toward the sealed room in front of him. This disciple of his had only learned swordsmanship from him for a night, and he had barely grasped one of his techniques. Given that his disciple did not have a deep understanding of the way of the sword yet, he could not help but wonder how well his disciple would perform. The first thing that Dan Xiaotian noticed upon entering the room was a round pedestal with a sword lodged tightly at the center. This must be the so-called sword god pedestal that Elder Lu Yun spoke of. The space directly in front of him was a vast wilderness. There were no walls at the front and top of the room in order to allow one's sword intent to traverse beyond several meters. Otherwise, it would have been terribly expensive to construct a room that could contain the manifestation of sword intent. Stepping onto the pedestal, Dan Xiaotian drew the sword and took a deep breath. Focusing all of his attention, he began driving his energy. Sword intent was built upon one's comprehension of swordsmanship. He had been practicing his swordsmanship for a decade ever since he was still young, so he carried deep comprehension and sentiments toward swordsmanship. Just by holding onto the sword, he felt as if his hand was melding into it. Instead of a weapon, it was an extension of his arm. Wang. Sensing his conceptualization, the sword began buzzing loudly as a milky white glow gathered around the sword god pedestal before advancing forth. With resolute eyes, Dan Xiaotian drove his energy to its limits. Po! The sword intent burst forth. Dan Xiaotian quickly opened his eyes to look into the distance, but what he saw made his face stiffen. A kai. In other words, a third of a meter. He had pushed his strength to his limits, but it turned out that the manifestation of his sword intent was only a third of a meter. If that was the case, did it not mean that his comprehension of swordsmanship could not even compare to that of a menial disciple? This can't be. Even Hu Jianghe wasn't a match for me back then. Dan Xiaotian's head nearly exploded. Elder Lu Yun had kept emphasizing how fair the sword god Hall was, but in a real battle, his swordsmanship was able to best even Hu Jianghe. How could his limit be just 0.33 meters? That was impossible. Wait a moment, I defeated Hu Jianghe with the sword toss. Maybe I should try that move. After a moment of hesitation, Dan Xiaotian remembered that he still had that powerful trump card. Thus, he took a deep breath before flicking his finger. Wang. The sword in his hand floated into the air. Hong long long. As soon as the sword left his grasp, an overwhelming sword intent burst forth from his body. In response, the sword also emanated its sword intent as well, and the room was swiftly filled with white mist. A powerful current gathered around the sword, like a swirling hurricane. Dan Xiaotian was stunned once more. When he pushed the sword intent within him to his limits, the manifestation was only 0.33 meters, but as soon as he used the sword toss technique that his teacher had imparted to him, before he had even shot out the sword, it had already caused such a huge commotion. If he finished executing the technique, what kind of results would he receive? Was there really such a huge difference between the swordsmanship that he had comprehended with 10 years of hard work and what his teacher had imparted to him? Go! With an awkward look on his face, Dan Xiaotian flicked the sword, and it immediately bolted into the distance. Hong long. White sword intent also flurried furiously forth along with the movement of the sword, vanishing from sight in the blink of an eye. Dan Xiaotian blinked in bewilderment. His own sword intent was only enough to reach 0.33 meters, but with his teacher's swordsmanship, the sword intent flew all the way out, till his eyes could not even see it anymore. This was definitely way more than 30, 50, or even 100 meters. Is it still flying? After waiting for a moment, the sword intent did not seem to have reached its end yet. This left Dan Xiaotian was a little stupefied. Did it shoot out a little too far, such that his results were invalidated? Wang. But while he was worrying over this matter, the wall beside him jolted a little before reflecting his results, 499 meters. He was just a meter short of becoming a sword god. Ten Li Sword God is also the author of Rebirth of the Urban Immortal Cultivator. The two authors are close friends with one another. Chapter 1946. Zhongxian takes the examination. Coming to realize what was going on, Dan Xiaotian sighed deeply in lamentation. It seems like I have only managed to learn my teacher's sword art, but I haven't grasped the fundamental sword intent and the like yet. He had thought that with his 10 years of hard work, it would not be too difficult for him to become a menial disciple in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. However, it seemed like he had overestimated his own capabilities. He was a long way off from reaching the mark. It was no wonder Xue Qin, despite not lacking resources and being under the guidance of Xue Chen, had barely made it as a menial disciple. Considering how he had practiced swordsmanship alone and could not even use Zhenqi back then. Most likely, the 0.33 meters was also the result of his training ever since he came under his teacher. If it had been before then, it was likely that he would not have scored anything at all. I have only learned the movements behind teacher's sword art, not the theories behind it, but I'm already able to bring the sword intent this far. If I understand the full conceptualization behind it, I wonder how powerful I'll be able to become, Dan Xiaotian thought. The current Dan Xiaotian was reminiscent of a child who had learned how to solve mathematical problems through rote learning. He could derive the answer, but when asked why he had used a specific model or the details behind his solution, well, his face would turn completely blank. A person could be well versed with Ode to Gallantry, reciting it so soulfully that it evoked the emotions of others. However, that did not necessarily mean that they had become a poet like Li Bai, capable of coming up with verses that transcended time. Despite being in such a position, Dan Xiaotian's sword intent was able to reach 499 meters. If he had mastered the true wisdom of his teacher, he had no doubt that he would have been able to achieve way more than that. Speaking of which, did this not mean that his teacher had already far surpassed the 500 meters mark, reaching a level that far exceeded those from the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion? I should quickly swap with my teacher so that he can give it a try too. Dan Xiaotian thought in agitation as he rushed out of the room. Even the swordsmanship that he had learned for a day or two was so formidable. He had no doubt that his teacher would be able to set a new record. Upon seeing Dan Xiaotian, Elder Lu Yun anxiously asked, "How is it? Did you exceed 30 meters?" While he was confident that Dan Xiaotian would meet the prerequisite, his heart could not help but tremble in trepidation till he finally received the answer. "I did." Dan Xiaotian nodded with a reddened face. In truth, his own comprehension of swordsmanship only produced a manifestation of 0.33 meters, but if he admitted that, he would be driven out immediately. Thus, after much contemplation, he had decided to go along with it for the time being. He would just have to work a lot harder to make up for his weakness in the future. Elder Lu first heaved a sigh of relief after hearing that Dan Xiaotian had cleared the examination before inquiring for further details. "How long was the manifestation of your sword intent?" He had witnessed Dan Xiaotian's swordsmanship the other day. It was an incredible work of art, such that even the first senior of the outer disciples, Hu Jianghe, was no match for it. That in itself should be enough to put Dan Xiaotian among the top few inner disciples. "Well, this is my result," Dan Xiaotian replied as he passed a jade token over. He had recorded the results reflected on the wall when they appeared earlier. Seeing that Dan Xiaotian was so embarrassed as to present him with the jade token instead of saying out loud, Elder Lu Yun instinctively assumed that Dan Xiaotian's results would be horrible. "You need not be too concerned about your current results. You are still young, and as long as you are able to join the ranks of the inner disciples, there's no doubt that you'll be able to improve swiftly in the future." But before he could finish his words, he caught sight of what was written on the jade token, and his eyes nearly bulged out. 4 to 499 meters. UN. Dan Xiaotian nodded with a crimson face. It sure was embarrassing to lie so blatantly. Elder Lu Yun alternated between Dan Xiaotian's embarrassed expression and the jade token in his hand, and he clutched his hair in frenzy. "Is there something wrong with you? Your embarrassed look made me think that you have barely reached 30 meters or so, but the hell, your score is actually 499 meters. Do you know how many freaking core disciples would love to achieve the same result as you but are unable to do so? You are already on the verge of becoming a sword god. Do you know that? Despite being so powerful, your face still reddened in embarrassment at your score. What am I then? A walking manifestation of humiliation? Elder Lu Yun felt as if his dignity had been hung upside down and hammered back and forth. He had seen plenty of disciples who were upset by their poor results, but this was the very first time that he had seen someone with such a good result putting on such an expression. The scenario was felt just like how, on the day the examination results were released, you spotted a student who started bawling non-stop, so you went over to console him. After much consolation, the student finally revealed the true reason behind his sadness. In an examination of 100 marks, he has only scored 99. But you, who went over to console him, only scored 9. Elder Lu Yun had never desired to simply vanish from the spot as much as he did at that instant. He took 2 huge breaths before asking, "Are you feeling embarrassed by your results?" "Yes. It's simply too awkward." Dan Xiaotian covered his face shyly. Elder Lu Yun's heart began thumping so wildly from rage that he had to strike his chest heavily again and again in order to calm himself down. Not wanting to talk to this fellow anymore, he took another deep breath before turning to Zhongxian and asking, "Do you want to head in to give it a try as well?" He was afraid that he would start getting violent if he continued talking to Dan Xiaotian. "This. All right then." Zhongxian nodded as he made his way in. Along the way, he could not help but think, while this student of mine hasn't learned much of my swordsmanship, he did learn my humility and low-profile attitude well. Not bad. It seemed like he was a talent that could be molded. Closing the doors, Zhongxian walked up to the sword god pedestal. "Chem, why is there no sword here?" Zhongxian took a look around, but the room was utterly empty. There was no sword to be seen at all. According to what Elder Lu Yun had said, there should have been a sword there. Could it be that the swordsmanship evaluation did not require a sword? That did not sound quite right. Then again, Dan Xiaotian had been there earlier, which meant that it should be possible to do it without a sword. But still, to be able to produce a manifestation of 499 meters without a sword, I might have been underestimating Dan Xiaotian's talent. Perhaps the sword god pedestal did not provide swords to use. Thinking back, most of the disciples whom he had seen outside were carrying swords on their backs. Without a doubt, it would be a huge handicap without a sword in hand. To achieve a result of nearly a li despite that, his student really did not let him down. Since his student was able to do it without a sword, as his teacher, he should at least be able to do the same. Thus, Zhongxian took a deep breath before releasing all of his sword intent at once. The sword quintessences that he had learned back on the master-teacher continent revolved in his mind as he raised his finger slightly. A cluster of incredibly condensed sword qi began gathering on his fingertip. Along with the accumulation of his sword qi, a white mist burst forth from the pedestal and swiftly gathering around Zhongxian. But instead of shooting forth, the white mist fused together with Zhongxian's sword qi. It was as if the white mist had submitted to Zhongxian's sword intent and dared not take a step further without his instructions. Seeing this sight, Zhongxian's lips twitched. What the heck was going on? If this was the case, did it not mean that his manifestation of sword intent was not even a single meter long? Surely he was not inferior to his own direct disciple, right? If that was really the case, it would really be a huge embarrassment. This is unacceptable. I need to gather more sword intent and surpass my limit. Zhongxian recounted the swordsmanship that he had learned back at the Sword Lagoon, the Zhong clan, and the conceptualization that he had felt when he first entered the clan earlier. Those sword quintessences revolved around his mind, and an indomitable aura burst forth from his body. In an instant, it felt like he had become a massive sword that could hack the world in two. Hong Long. As his sword intent heightened to its limits, the amount of white mist gathering in the room was growing at a terrifying rate. In the blink of an eye, it was as if the room had become the scene of a disastrous fire. With the sheer concentration of sword intent there, the thick white mist was starting to condense into fluid. Is it still less than 1 meter? Impossible. Zhongxian had already gone to such an extent, but when he looked in front, the manifestation of his sword intent was still less than 1 meter. How was that possible? His lips twitched, and he nearly fainted on the spot. It could not be that despite his formidable swordsmanship, he was still not on par with a menial disciple, right? But if that was the case, How could Dan Xiaotian reach 499 meters with that third-tier swordsmanship of his? I don't believe it. Sword intent of the world, come under my command. Zhong Xian roared deeply as his zhenqi and soul morphed into the form of a sword. He absorbed the lingering sword intent in the air and focused them on the accumulation of sword qi on his fingertip. If his disciple could achieve so much without a sword in hand, he would be embarrassed to death if he could not even do the same. No matter what, he could not lose. This was for his reputation and dignity as Dan Xiaotian's teacher. A young man was standing amid the crowd in the Sword God Hall with a sword on his back. As soon as he stepped into the lobby, there was not a single person who dared approach him. It was as if he had a natural disposition that pushed the crowd away from him. Crisp laughter echoed in the air, and the crowd dispersed once more, opening up a path for another young man to walk through. Junior Yi Lian, are you here to evaluate your swordsmanship again? Are you interested in competing with me? This young man had a powerful-looking silhouette. Due to his height that towered over the others in the room, he stood like a crane standing in the midst of a pack of chickens. Senior He Yang, if you wish to compete with me, I'm more than happy to accompany you, the young man known as Yi Lian replied calmly. Please. He Yang gestured toward the rooms with a bright smile before taking the first step forward. Yi Lian gracefully followed him and entered the room adjacent to He Yang's. There was a partition between the rooms, but as there was no wall at the front, they were still able to see the manifestation of sword intent of those in the nearby rooms, allowing them to make comparisons. Seeing the disposition of the two, a newly arrived inner disciple asked those around him, "Are they the famed Senior Yi and Senior He of the core disciples?" "Yes, that's them. I heard that they have been trying to achieve the level of Sword God, and they have been competing with one another for the past 5 years to see who can reach that level first." One of the more knowledgeable disciples in the area replied with a nod. Yi Lian and He Yang were a few of the more well-known core disciples due to their unique dispositions and formidable swordsmanship. Due to their similar proficiency in swordsmanship, the two of them had been competing with one another for many years, especially in recent years when they were only a few steps away from reaching Sword God. That had brought them into the focus of all of the disciples in the Ascendant Cloud Sword Pavilion. Everyone was interested to see who would reach that illustrious height first. "Senior He, why don't you go first?" Yi Lian said quietly as he stepped onto the pedestal and drew the sword. One had to use the sword on the Sword God pedestal for the test in order for the results to be reflected. The reason most disciples chose to carry their swords on their back was to better channel their sword intent through the use of a familiar medium and achieve a higher level of swordman union. "Let's begin together." From the adjacent room, He Yang chuckled heartily as he grabbed the sword from the pedestal and channeled his sword intent into it. Hong Long. An endless stream of sword intent gushed out from his acupoints and flowed through the sword in his hand. TSLA. The manifestation of his sword intent shot out of the room, covering dozens of meters in an instant. Seeing He Yang's manifestation of sword intent, Yi Lian also began the test, and his manifestation of sword intent swiftly shot forth and caught up with He Yang's. From afar, it looked like two divine beings were racing alongside one another. Seeing that Yi Lian was on the verge of catching up with him, He Yang chuckled softly. "Your speed isn't too bad, Junior. You've clearly been working hard these past 6 months. Senior, you clearly haven't been slacking either. The speed of manifestation is much faster than before," Yi Lian remarked calmly. "I guess we are about equal then. Fine, let's see who will reach 500 meters and become a sword god first." With a roar, He Yang released all of his sword intent at once, causing his manifestation to charge forth with incredible momentum. However, before it could get far, the manifestation of his sword intent suddenly halted. It shuddered intensely as if it was standing before a superior being, similar to how a serpent would grovel before a divine dragon. No matter how He Yang exerted himself, the manifestation of his sword intent simply would not go any further. Narrowing his eyes, he glanced He Yang's way and saw that the same situation was happening to He Yang. His sword intent manifestation was shuddering non-stop, and it would not inch forward at all. "What's going on here?" He Yang was taken aback. But at that moment, the manifestations of their sword intent suddenly shattered with a resounding buzz. "Pu." Fresh blood spurted from their mouths as they collapsed to the ground. Ode to Gallantry is a famous poem by Li Bai. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.